Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you are. I'm Mark McClellan. I'm the director of the Duke Margolis Center for Health Policy, and pleased to be joining you all today for our fourth annual Real-World Evidence public meeting on applying lessons learned from real-world evidence in the time of COVID-19 to the future. That's kind of a mouthful, but we've learned a lot, and we've seen a lot of advancements and new insights in real-world evidence. They were happening anyway, but they've been certainly influenced by the COVID pandemic. And we're going to talk today about what some of those are and some of their implications for the future. For this discussion, I really want to thank the Duke Margolis Real-World Evidence Collaborative COVID Working Group. They've provided some extremely valuable input based on work that they're doing, ideas for broadening the overall efforts around advancing real-world evidence in the pandemic. They spend a lot of time as well helping us with today's agenda for this public workshop. It's part of our ongoing efforts at the Duke Margolis Center for Health Policy's Real-World Evidence Collaborative. That's a multi-stakeholder coalition focused on progressing the use of real-world data and evidence to improve patient treatment options and outcomes more broadly. Today's meeting is going to cover the ways in which evidence generation has evolved to meet the current needs posed by the pandemic. This in part is a function of some of the new innovative uses of technologies, data, and evidence that have made possible by advancements in recent years. We're going to explore how COVID has accelerated decision maker understanding and actually need for the use of real world data and real world evidence in this context, and then how that could extend to a post-COVID environment. Before we start, I'd like to give a brief overview of the real-world evidence community's response to the pandemic and a quick run-through of the agenda that we intend to cover today. So first off, on ongoing real-world data and real-world evidence activity, I think that may be the next slide. Yeah, so regulatory activities, sponsor activities, data partner activities, researcher activities, clinician, patient, stakeholders, all are engaging in efforts to apply real-world evidence to complement the evidence generated through randomized controlled trials and contribute to the totality of evidence available for addressing regulatory questions in this time period. In 2018, as a part of the 21st Century Cures and PDUFA user fee mandates, FDA released their real-world evidence framework, which is a big milestone towards establishing real-world evidence as a program, as a key part of FDA's regulatory approaches. Now, that broad framework, it's high level, it lays out the major regulatory considerations. Number one, evaluating whether real-world data is fit for use for the particular regulatory use. Number two, ensuring that the trial or study design used to develop the evidence, the real-world evidence, can adequately answer the question of interest. So the data are right, the methods are right. And number three, assessing whether the study meets regulatory requirements for study conduct, or the study is actually conducted right. Since then, FDA has continued to expand the real-world evidence program internal activities. For example, the Technology Modernization Action Plan, which we'll hear more about today, I think, with Amy Abernethy, and then the recently launched Digital Health Center of Excellence. This has included pilot programs like the RCT duplicate to gain some better insights into how non-randomized study methods align or may differ from randomized methods. One source to automate the flow of structured EHR data in trials. FDA's My Studies app to support trials and registries. CMS linkage to the PCORI Reliance trial to understand what exposure and outcome information can be assessed through Medicare data. And FDA has also released several guidance documents in this general area, including on submitting documents using real-world data and real-world evidence to FDA. And these considerations all remain important as this whole community of researchers, regulators, policymakers continue to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. looking ahead to the next reauthorization of PDUFA, I think all of these stakeholders are going to be looking for opportunities to build on the progress made under PDUFA 6, under 21st Century Cures, to get these frameworks and concepts into more widespread and routine practice as part of FDA's efforts to really expand the totality of evidence available for informed regulatory decisions in a context where we're relying more on electronic data, where real world data is becoming richer, and for all the reasons that I just described, the methods, the validity of the data, the best approaches are becoming better understood, moving from sort of the early initial conceptual and pilot phases of real world evidence into more widespread use, all occurring at a time when COVID has forced us to look hard at the best ways to develop evidence to respond to a public health emergency. And I think on the next slide, COVID has required the healthcare system to change the way it delivers care, and along with that, some changes in the way that studies are conducted, and new pressures, new needs for generating evidence in the context of a pandemic with a novel disease, and initially, by definition, no treatment options, and a real need to understand the course of disease, understand how it's being treated, and understand better what we can do to improve the outcomes in an emergent situation. The large evidence generation needs posed by COVID in this environment have given us some real interest, real reasons to try to leverage real world data sources. And there are several innovative real world evidence activities that have been initiated to address COVID, including curating new data sources, collaborating in new ways to generate evidence, putting some of the usual competitive and proprietary issues aside, since we're all in this together, supporting research through shared resources, supporting care and care coordination. And today we're going to focus on 3 areas of innovation that have resulted from COVID, but we think are here to stay. One is progress on practical trials, clinical trials that integrate and rely more on data generated in the real world context. Second is on digital tools and technology. And the third is on multi-stakeholder collaboration. We've proven that we can work together more in this context. Let's find a way to build on that. So first, in terms of practical trials, by leveraging electronic health records, practical trials can help limit provider burden regarding data collection, limit the burden on patients by integrating collection into more routine care, and keeping it simple by using digital data collection technologies and virtual trial and enrollment supports. This has been done in some of the most productive trials in the COVID era, like Recovery, working in a large number of hospitals, community hospitals throughout England. The goal of practical trials is to make it easier to bring randomization into the delivery of care in the COVID context, where we really don't know what works, and we're facing some very concerning outcomes, high rates of mortality, especially among patients who are admitted to ICUs. Also makes it easier to reduce data collection burden. Anything that makes it easier to participate in the trial, especially in the COVID emergent context, is going to make it easier to get more patients enrolled and generate more data. Practical trials, to the extent they are part of networks like Recovery, using consistent methods, can support alignment on endpoints, alignment on aspects of data collection that really make the trials more productive. So we're going to come back to those issues in more detail about how they can help answer important questions that are challenging and that are difficult to address through the traditional trial designs, especially with limited trial capacity. Second major area around digital tools and technology. Obviously, digital tools have been a mainstay of response to the pandemic, remote patient monitoring, telemedicine, and the like, collecting data from sensors and so forth. This was happening already, but boy, it's been accelerated as part of the pandemic, and both redesigning or rethinking clinical trials and providing sources of data that just weren't available before. So we're discovering and implementing new ways to use these tools to not only continue trials, but to enable a lot more supplemental real-world data collection. And third, in terms of multi-stakeholder collaboration, there are a number of public and private entities leveraging the growing, increasingly sophisticated real-world evidence infrastructure through multi-stakeholder collaborations to answer questions and evidence gaps related to COVID. The more that we can build that off a common frame, common data elements, aligned analytic plans, the more that the learnings are going to be able to integrate rather than just being fragmented and isolated. And now the work to boost the real-world data infrastructure can potentially be a base for future efforts, future pandemic response or capacity for more rapid and more efficient response to understand what's going on with care and impact in a pandemic, but potentially for a range of other activities as well. So on the next slide, many of the topics that we were working on in real-world evidence and as part of our collaborative are ones that have been accelerated by the COVID context. And now, while we still have a serious ways to go in the pandemic, it is a good time to also start asking which of these activities that have been extended in the pandemic can be built on for the future. And how do we plan for that, both to continue and hopefully enhance our pandemic response by showing a reason to invest more in these new developments, and to help us get to a permanently more effective foundation for real-world evidence in the regulatory decision infrastructure. So looking ahead, I think on the next slide, we want to continue building on and learning from these existing efforts as we continue to make our way through the pandemic and beyond. We'd like to initiate some collaborative pilots as kind of a next phase in these activities. We still got a bit of the chicken and egg problem of, there is a framework out there, increasingly rich regulatory structure, but not that many people have used it and developed it yet. So FDA, I think, is interested in seeing more applications. They've said so in all these guidance documents and so forth. On the other hand, while companies are too, they've got a lot at stake in the investments they make around their products, and it can be a bit challenging and worrisome to make a big move in this direction. So can we support more pilots, practical steps to move from guidance to actual implementation, pilots where we could share the information developed, things that are non-proprietary, and help move along the entire capacity of the field, the entire confidence in the field. Also important to this is developing and enriching the real-world data infrastructure further to support making it easier to bring data together, make it easier to combine with randomization, making it easier to accomplish all of these promising activities that are underway now and could be increased. So that's a context for what we're going to talk about today. And if you go to the next slide, I think in the agenda, first off, we're going to, real pleasure to hear from John Concato, who's the Deputy Director of the Office of Medical Policy Initiatives at CDER, the Drug Evaluation and Research Center at FDA, talking about FDA's perspective on a lot of these issues and context. We're then going to have 3 sessions with expert panelists from a range of perspectives, talking about the implementation of practical trials using real-world data, the utilization of digital tools to facilitate trial data capture, their impact on advancing novel endpoints, and then third, enhancement of the post-market evidence generation activity that has been going on before. That's not new for real-world data use for surveillance, but it's bigger now and can perhaps be enhanced further through new collaborations that are developed in the COVID context. And finally, we're going to end with what I think will be a very interesting discussion with one of the leaders in these efforts at FDA, FDA Principal Deputy Commissioner Amy Abernethy. So that's an overview for the day. Before we get started, just a couple of household things. We're recording this webcast. It will be available on the Duke Margolis website after the event. All of our participants are going to be muted for the duration of the event. We are very glad to have you with us, and we do want to hear from you. If you want to get more information about the event, please go to the Duke Margolis website. We've got the agenda, speaker bios, discussion questions, and other relevant news and publications for real-world evidence. We want your participation in the meeting. As you see on the slide here, please send an email to margolisevents@duke.edu, and we will work to get your questions and comments into the discussion. And please join us on Twitter. Let's get the conversation going there. The meeting hashtag is it's a hashtag RWE 2020. So now I'd like to turn to Dr. John Concato, the Deputy Director of the Office of Medical Policy Initiatives, as I mentioned before, who's going to talk about some of OMP's recent work in the real-world evidence space before and during the pandemic. John, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Mark, for having me, as well as the Duke Margolis. And good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to what promises to be an informative and impactful discussion. Again, besides our moderator, thanks to each of the panelists for taking the time to participate today, and especially the staff at Duke Margolis for their extensive behind-the-scenes work in organizing the meeting. And finally, I want to acknowledge really too many to name colleagues at the FDA. So to get started, and as Mark indicated, today's program really should deliver important insights regarding real-world evidence, or RWE. With more than 7 million cases and 200 deaths in the United States alone, COVID has affected us all, of course, personally and professionally. For anyone working with real-world evidence, the challenge is to determine how to make a difference using RWE during the pandemic, and at the same time, identify and leverage what we've learned going forward. Our current predicament then sets up an obvious way to describe the evolution of real-world evidence. First, in the time before COVID, now during the COVID pandemic, and then in a future state that will represent a new normal, but we'll only know what that looks like after we've been there for a while. So my comments will focus primarily on the first 2 or 3 categories I mentioned: the status of RWE when COVID hit, how COVID is impacting RWE as Mark described, and finally I'll leave the question of what RWE might look like after COVID quiets down to our esteemed panelists and moderator. So starting with RWE pre-COVID, today's forum really provides an opportunity for me to summarize the progress that an awful lot of staff at FDA have been working towards in terms of fulfilling our obligation under the 21st Century Cures Act and also under the current Prescription Drug User Fee Act. Mark and I did not compare notes, but as I go over the 4 domains: framework and guidance development, external stakeholder engagement, internal agency processes, and demonstration projects, it should come as no surprise that he and I are highlighting similar entities, similar activities. So first, regarding framework and guidance development, and as Mark mentioned, and hopefully everyone is aware, FDA's framework for real-world evidence was published in December 2018. It has a wide range of information describing FDA's initial perspective regarding real-world data and real-world evidence for drugs and biologics. Here, I'll remind us that real-world data, RWD, are data relating to patient health status or the delivery of healthcare routinely collected from a variety of sources. And as we know, real-world evidence is clinical evidence about the use and potential benefits and risks of a medical product derived from analysis of RWD. So as a major take-home message from the framework, and as Mark again mentioned, 3 considerations are emphasized. First, are the real-world data fit for use? Second, does the study design generate adequate scientific evidence? And third, does the study conduct meet FDA regulatory requirements? Here I'll just say the agency cannot overstate how important these 3 considerations are when designing, conducting, and evaluating real-world evidence. The framework also mentions that development of guidance on RWE is a priority, and we're working towards releasing guidance documents in step with statutory deadlines. Mark alluded to the recently published guidance on submitting documents with RWD, RWE, and that's important for tracking purposes. But FDA is also preparing other guidance documents to address fitness for use of real-world data adequacy of study design, and related regulatory considerations, although not with those exact titles. I also should mention other non-RWE guidance released either before or after 21st Century Cures was passed are also relevant to RWE. As just one example, final guidance that was published in July 2018 on use of electronic health records in clinical investigations, that guidance provides recommendations on ensuring the integrity of EHR data in clinical investigations of medical products. So it's really a matrix approach, if you will, but we are certainly focused on the RWE guidance documents proper. Regarding external stakeholders in RWE, the agency continues to support robust engagement via a real-world evidence subcommittee that discusses projects and initiatives aimed at advancing the utility of RWE. This subcommittee, staffed by representatives and leadership from the Center for Drugs and the Center for Biologics, is the hub for efforts in support of real-world evidence. In addition, various public meetings have been held, often in conjunction with Duke Margolis, that promote shared understanding of RWE among all parties involved. And by coincidence, again, the two that I happened to pick were the same two that were on Mark's slides, establishing a high-quality RWD ecosystem and conducting clinical trials in routine healthcare settings. Turning next to internal agency processes, I'll summarize a variety of activities by emphasizing that at the same time external stakeholders were exploring options for using RWD and RWE, in parallel, CDER and CBER were advancing RWE-related efforts and promoting greater understanding in the field. Although a sponsor's experience with the subcommittee, the RWE subcommittee, will necessarily have been episodic based on each submission or activity, the subcommittee itself has been accumulating a broad exposure to state-of-the-art developments that helps to promote consistency across review divisions, among other benefits. In this and other ways, FDA is seeking to be agnostic towards the type of evidence it receives, while at the same time upholding the agency's appropriately stringent evidentiary standards. Last but not least is the category of demonstration projects. FDA continues to support various efforts focused on understanding data quality, improving RWE tools, and evaluating RWE approaches with regulatory intent. You'll hear about some of these projects during today's meeting, and I'll mention several examples now to highlight the spectrum of activities involved. First, if we consider RWE in a clinical trial setting, the Reliance trial, funded by the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, is enrolling patients with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease and randomizing them to treatment with either a phosphodiesterase inhibitor or an antibiotic. The real-world data component includes the fact that all-cause hospitalization and all-cause mortality endpoints will be captured through EHRs at participating sites, as well as through linkage to Medicare claims data and other mechanisms. As a second example, in this case involving tools to promote the use of RWD in clinical trials, the FDA My Studies app was already being used pre-COVID to capture real-world endpoints, and the app has been repurposed during the pandemic as COVID My Studies to help obtain informed consent from patients securely when face-to-face contact is impossible due to infection control measures. This theme of adaptation during COVID will come up later, reflecting a pattern of how what existed pre-COVID for RWD and RWE can be modified during the pandemic and remain useful well beyond. Another component of pre-COVID RWE involves observational, that is, non-interventional studies. In this category, a project known by the acronym DUPLICATE, again, as Mark mentioned, is analyzing administrative claims data and comparing the results to either completed randomized trials or to findings from ongoing trials when those trials are done. To improve our understanding of RWE, FDA is committed to bring results from this important project to a public forum for robust discussion. From a methodologic perspective, a demonstration project known as DETECT-E is evaluating methods for assessing the impact of unmeasured confounding in observational studies, and another project is evaluating the use of targeted maximum likelihood estimation and causal estimation for observational studies as well as clinical trials. And finally, FDA has recently funded 4 RWD-RWE proposals in a very competitive RFA, Request for Applications award cycle. The bottom line, as I hope you can tell, is that FDA has had extensive engagement with RWE before COVID. Okay, the second major focus of my remarks involves the use of RWE during the pandemic, which is a subset of the much broader topic of how clinical research in general has been affected by COVID. While offering specific comments, I'll also emphasize two misconceptions about RWE that have been magnified during the COVID pandemic. The first misconception is that a simple dichotomy exists between randomized trials and observational studies, as was reflected in a recent article titled, quote, "The Magic of Randomization versus the Myth of Real-World Evidence," close quote. No one disputes the value of randomization as an indispensable tool in the toolbox of clinical research, but a dichotomy is at best shorthand. The reality is not all clinical trials that assign treatment to participants are randomized, as we know. Rather, the defining feature of a clinical trial is investigator-assigned therapy done according to a study protocol. We need only point to drug approvals based on single-arm trials without a concurrent comparison group to highlight the problem of adopting a binary randomized versus observational approach. The take-home message here is that study architecture was already complex before COVID, and now out of necessity, and with the potential for positive impact, study designs are getting more creative during COVID. The Recovery and I-SPY platform trials are prominent examples of how COVID is pushing the boundaries of clinical trial study design. I don't have time to discuss strengths and limitations involved with platform trials, but it's good news that we're in the process of learning more about them. Similarly, clinical trials with pragmatic elements or adaptive designs are being utilized to evaluate therapies for COVID. The second misconception is that real-world evidence is synonymous with observational research. Today's audience is aware that real-world evidence can include evidence from clinical trials involving real-world data, but in addition, analysis of any and all data from clinical practice is sometimes presented as real-world evidence. The reality is, however, that a difference exists between research questions, study designs, and statistical analyses that are descriptive only, as opposed to those that are analytic, that is, with the corresponding cause-effect research question. It's okay if we want to refer informally to data used in descriptive analyses as data coming from the real world, but a descriptive analysis of a case series of patients diagnosed with COVID, let's say data describing baseline characteristics and treatment received, does not represent real-world evidence in a regulatory context. Rather, real-world evidence would typically be either a clinical trial of therapeutic agents to treat COVID, or perhaps an observational cohort analysis of patients who receive various agents during routine clinical care. Given how little we know about COVID, randomized trials would certainly have more than their usual advantage over other study designs in terms of determining an unbiased estimate of therapeutic efficacy. But this second misconception also provides an opportunity to highlight important initiatives in the RWE space. One example is the National COVID Cohort Collaborative Data Enclave, or NC3, an initiative launched by the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences and serving as a data resource for researchers to use in studying COVID. Another example is the COVID-19 Evidence Accelerator, an initiative launched by the Reagan-Udall Foundation for FDA in collaboration with Friends of Cancer Research. As has been emphasized by Dr. Amy Abernethy, FDA Principal Deputy Commissioner, the Accelerator provides a novel venue for data organizations, government and academic researchers, and healthcare systems to collaboratively discuss, design, and report out within weeks on parallel analyses of data regarding COVID and its treatment. Both NC3 and the Evidence Accelerator were prompted by COVID and are expanding our clinical research capacity in the era of big data. A separate focused analysis of real-world data was conducted recently by FDA's Oncology Center of Excellence and collaborators, finding that among patients with cancer, those who contracted COVID-19 had more serious outcomes, including mortality, and that racial and socioeconomic inequities existed. These examples highlight that whether to conduct descriptive analyses or cause-effect observational studies, and whether to inform trial design, assess generalizability, examine disparities in healthcare, or even explore selected inferences, the take-home message, again, is that we're learning along the way and will undoubtedly be better off for it. Finally, and after mentioning selected activities and specific misconceptions, I'll note that time doesn't allow for more than a quick reminder regarding two basic yet important truisms. Attention to both methodologic principles and professional standards will go a long way in promoting the quality of and the confidence in real-world evidence. So as I wrap up, there's no doubt that COVID-19 will have had a major impact on RWD and RWE in a future post-pandemic environment. We've already become more comfortable with remote assessments, use of digital health technologies, and collaborative analyses, just to name a few. But as is often the case, the devil is in the details. With that, let's get started with the first of 3 sessions that each will offer an in-depth discussion of what we've learned and guide us towards an improved future state. Thank you.
Great. John, thank you very much for covering. That's a great overview and teed up the issues that we're going to be talking about now. And boy, it is a more complex environment, and great way to frame the issues that we need to address so that we can do high quality work. So let's get going on this first session right now on practical trials in electronic health records and how to build on them. If you go to the next slide, I think people may have a basic question about what is a practical trial. Key points here, just for level setting everyone, is that it is an enhanced trial, enhanced in terms of size, so an enhanced large simple trial with randomization and data collection that's intended to be streamlined and embedded as possible in routine clinical care. That is not that burdensome. An example of this is the recovery trial, which relies on simplified data collection using electronic case reporting forms, and it's already returned a number of positive results, including on dexamethasone, as well as important negative results, antiretrovirals, for example, to inform the standard of care for COVID, not just in England, but around the world. The idea of large-scale enrollment is that more compounds can potentially be tested. That gets to some of the adaptive issues that John mentioned before. And size leads to power in order to get to conclusions that are clinically significant. Janet Woodcock and I, in a session a couple of days ago, talked about this topic, with Janet going so far as to say that maybe time for a reckoning in terms of designing clinical trials so they can be conducted more readily in a real-world context, because by her estimation, only about 6% of the clinical trials underway in COVID are going to lead to clinically meaningful evidence, because they aren't at scale, because they aren't following consistent methods like you'd see in a large-scale platform trial. Next slide goes over some of the key characteristics of practical trial protocols. I'm going to leave these for discussion with our group. So we go to the next slide. We've got 5 terrific panelists to talk about their important work in the practical trial space. Rob Califf from Verily Life Sciences and Google Health did some very early, Rob is called the father of practical trials from all that work with Gusto, but has been long involved in this topic. Laura Esserman, University of California, San Francisco, with the iSpy network, brought this kind of approach first to cancer care, and now the iSpy COVID program is bringing it to phase 2 studies of a larger number of compounds than would be possible without this kind of platform-based simple approach. Pam Tennert's Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative leader, has long been involved in clinical trials transformation, including in the implementation of some of the previous path-breaking simple trials. Adrian Hernandez at Duke University School of Medicine has been integral in implementing PreCovid and some practical trial approaches there. And David Swergel from Novartis, also very involved in getting to bigger scale approaches to develop more evidence in a range of areas. So we're going to hear from them about how practical trials are emerging as a real, tangible, and implementable approach for improving evidence generation in COVID and potentially beyond. Each of our panelists is going to speak for about 5 minutes. We're going to open up to a moderated discussion. And so let me turn to our first panelist. Rob, thanks for joining us today.
Hey Mark, thanks. This is quite a group, and I wish we had a couple hours, but we don't. I understand we've each got 5 minutes to lay it out there, and then really look forward to the discussion. And I have a great respect for the work the other panelists are doing. So I'm going to zip through some slides here, and hopefully they'll be useful in the long run. Let's go to the next slide. Just Mark, I don't consider myself the father of practical trials, but I certainly came along pretty close to the start. And I just want to remind everybody, now that we're in the vaccine era, that the polio vaccine trials, which I benefited from, I didn't participate. I was born in 1951. These were 1954. 1.8 million children randomized are entered, with 600,000 randomized in another cohort at other sites, treated and observed. Along came Oxford with large simple trials, which you've alluded to. And we came along afterwards with Gusto, which you've mentioned, which I regard as really automating the large simple trial. It still astounds young people when I tell them that the great innovation that enabled us to do this was the fax machine, because we didn't have an internet to speed communications. And when the fax machine proliferated, we could suddenly randomize all around the world. And it was really part of the culture. And in fact, I would have said in 1990, we were there. So when I look at, when I hear people say, well, COVID is stimulating this, I would say it's like COVID is bringing it back from the dead, because it's not new. It's something that we've known for a long time. And then there have been a series of efforts to try to move along evidence generation through practical methods that I've listed here. And my fellow panelists are key participants in those efforts. And then finally along came the pandemic with the recovery trial, asking many of us to ask, why can't we do what the recovery trial is doing, or recapture what we already knew in the 1980s and maybe even the 1950s? Go to the next slide. So this is my main proposition, is that we have a clinical trials enterprise which by and large doesn't answer the most important questions that people need. Does a great job of developing drugs and devices through the early phases. It does a lot of other things, but it doesn't really very often answer the question, out of the options that people have for what to do about health and healthcare, which ones are better. And I think if we are going to overcome the hurdles, we've got to deal with the fragmentation and misaligned incentives in our system. Go to the next slide. These are just 4 slides I show every time. It's not like we don't know what to do. We know that the early clinical trials that are done can give us the answer, is this better than nothing? But it can't give us the answer out of the options that we have. Which should we choose? And what are the overall risks and benefits in a comparative world, which is what we live in? So this is nothing new, but the kind of trials we're talking about today are the ones that are intended to deal with those issues. Next slide. And it's not like we have a system that's really working well overall. This is a slide from over a decade ago. As I've talked with a lot of people in the COVID era, and in my current job, I talk with a lot of people all over the world. The US is in an almost unique position of unhappiness among practitioners about both the state of knowledge and about the state of the way clinical trials are done. It's just too cumbersome and not really designed to be efficient. Next slide. And the evidence of it is that over 85% of our standard recommendations from clinical practice guidelines are not based on high quality evidence. And unfortunately, it hasn't gotten better over the last decade. So our pace of technology development is far exceeding our ability to get the studies done that can really give us high quality evidence to inform our decisions. What the pandemic has done for us, I think, is to bring public attention to the fact that in a case where people really want to know right now, the evidence is there. But it's not as if we went back to coronary disease or depression or you name it, that we actually have the kind of evidence we need for much of anything. Next slide. And the costs are going up in the old method, so we got to do something different. And, you know, I found John's talk to be inspiring and really good. The work is moving along a lot since I was left the FDA in 2016 as Cures was put together. But, you know, we have to do something different if we're going to close this evidence gap. Next slide. So I just want to put forward a concept that we need to really start being careful about the nomenclature, because when we say pragmatic or practical trials, it does have several different meanings that people tend to use. And Mark, I like your list of attributes of the kind of trial that we're talking about. It used to be called large simple, but I want to make the point, it doesn't have to be large. It just needs to be large enough. And the other attributes are really important. And we need to make sure that it has enough outcomes to reliably get an answer. And I also want to raise the concept that historically you might call these now simple trials plus. Next slide. Now the PreCovid criteria were developed to deal with the other kind of practical trial, which has a lot less emphasis on entry criteria and adherence to treatment than the kinds of trials that we're talking about today. But the PreCovid criteria that were developed, I think, is something we really ought to develop for the kind of trial that we're talking about today. And I hope that'll be an output of all the work that's going into moving this along in the pandemic era. Next slide. So what do I mean by large simple trial plus or practical trial plus? At the top are listed what the Oxford group wrote about in 1980, and we did in the 1980s and 1990s. It really has most to do with not confusing precision and reliability with having a large enough study to get reliable answers, and simplifying the data collection so that it's feasible to do a large enough study for the cost that's included. But we now have, due to the digital era, these things at the bottom, which we're going to talk about, or other panelists are all going to talk about, so I'm not going to dwell on the individual components. But I think if we looked at the large simple trial as sort of like a Christmas tree, and we said, what ornaments do we want to put on it? We don't want to put all the ornaments on every trial. What we want to do is to carefully select the enhancements listed below that will achieve the goals that we have. And I'm sure we'll have a good discussion about this in the panel. Almost done, so let's go to the next slide. And this would be a definition that I hope would be something that we might think about using. The real goal of a simple trial is to inform decision making. It's not to elucidate biology or social mechanisms. And the intent is to enroll a relevant population as a treatment might be used in practice. And so if we really keep in mind, what is the design of a trial that's going to optimally inform a decision maker in a relevant period of time, I hope that's the North Star we use. Next slide. So that's kind of a summary of what goes through my mind. I really look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Great, Rob. Thanks for covering so much ground in a limited amount of time, and looking forward to our other presenters too. And our next one is Laura Esserman.
Yeah, thanks so much, Mark. I would say, you know, I have the privilege of running the I-SPY 2 trial network in breast cancer, where we are trying to move drug development from the metastatic setting to the earlier stage setting, with the idea that if you could identify an early endpoint that you could manipulate with drugs, you could run a screening trial, not with a huge number of patients, but with enough to identify where are the big signals. And what we did when COVID came along, I had one of our pulmonary critical care faculty had spent a sabbatical with me, and NHLBI was thinking about this, but not feeling like it was very urgent. And all of a sudden COVID comes along, and I had spoken with Janet Woodcock about, I said, do you want us to try and replicate the I-SPY network across these sites? And you know, the idea that we came up with is that the reason why the pandemic is such a crisis is because there's a small portion of people who get critically ill, and we don't have the tools to tell. We don't know who's going to get it, but when they do get it, we don't have the drugs or the the interventions to keep them from dying or staying on ventilators for long periods of time. So if we really wanted to focus on something practical, take that group, you would focus on where you could make the most difference and see whether you could take people who were critically ill, high flow oxygen or on ventilators, with the idea, again, the same thing, not have hundreds and thousands of patients before you know what they are, but get enough patients to get who has the big signal, right? And try and say, how can you make a difference in a short period of time? And all of a sudden, where there were no drugs, suddenly there are drugs to test and lots of things to run through them, have a common control, get out there. And we used as our endpoint time to recovery because it has more power and because it's not binary. And you're also checking mortality with the idea that you identify the biggest signals and then run them back through and find out whether that's really going to make a difference. And how would you, and I think there's a lot of practical things that you have to think about when trying to run that. We actually found that this whole process of engaging your investigators, getting something up is really good, but focusing on a small, sufficient data set. And we made a choice to make sure that we tried to capture everyone in the ICU. So if they're not going on the trial, they're part of a real world evidence cohort, where that is actually part of what care should be. You know, this idea that real world evidence is some like insufficient data. Look, we don't get outcomes as a routine of care. That is a problem with medicine. The new way that we should practice should be making sure we track outcomes on everybody. And isn't that just real world data? And what we find is that there's a lot of things that we're stuck with, like double blinding that when you have a pre-competitive consortium with a common purpose, right, that includes this consortium that's not run by a group that has a vested interest necessarily, you can actually have open label trials. And one of the reasons you want to do that is a safety issue, right? Because if you have people, if you're randomizing to 4 different delivery mechanisms, IV, sub-Q, oral, or nebulized, the practicality of trying to double blind is ridiculous. And if you've got 20 sites open and multiple you can't really game the system. And people aren't actually trying to game the system because we don't have a preconceived notion of what's going to work. So what we found is that you could scale this whole enterprise and you can be efficient about it and look for a big impact. We were actually able to build from scratch this trial that would work and get it open in like 4 months. We now have, we're getting there. We have 100 patients on trial. Next slide. Not as much as we'd want, but as I would think about how, as I work with Mark and others to think about how to scale this, I think it's important for us to think about a new paradigm that accelerates progress. When I think about, there's the old gold standard and the new gold standard. The old gold standard, the features are, has to be randomized, has to be 1-to-1, has to be double blind, has to be fixed accrual, and it's all on the frequentist method. But there's a new gold standard that's emerging. People are looking for standing platform trials. You don't have to build a new trial platform every time you want to run another drug through. It's much faster to have a master protocol. It's much better to have accrual based on performance and learn as you go, because you're trying to hone in on what makes the most difference. And I think one of the key things we have to think about is we've sort of moved into this era where we collect all possible data, but then you've got a signal to noise problem. And the data is collected by coordinators. But what if you had a checklist of mission critical data? That's actually part of how you do care, as part of real world evidence, as part of clinical care. Then everything changes, right? You've got source data for primary endpoints. You don't have to collect everything. When you want to go into the details, once you've got something that works, you can go into those details. Report for your serious events. And the attribution based on adverse events, who cares? Actually, if there's a higher, proportion of these events in one arm, then you're going to assign attribution. And research and care has to be integrated, the same system. Enter once and use many. Next slide. So, when I think about breaking down the barriers and trying to think, how do we get there? And I'm not going to go through this in all detail, but I think you've got industry, you've got the delivery systems, you got payers, you've got the FDA, and then you've got this notion of real world evidence. And I think in COVID, the industry has been actually very willing to move. It's been a struggle to get people on board. I think industry will follow the FDA's lead. If the FDA is going to look at these trials and use regulatory endpoints, they will follow, sometimes reluctantly, but I think you don't need everyone to follow. You need certain people to follow. I actually think the delivery systems are absolutely the worst here. If you're contracting on a hospital by hospital basis, if every site has multiple competing trials, and there's just this business of, there's just a huge hurdle for write back and data sharing. Our current electronic health records are not organized for quality improvement, and you shouldn't have to go to the IRB to get permission to collect the data that allows you to do your job. It's one of the things that just drives me crazy. And the whole idea is, if you did that, then you would have the data that you need. And I actually think payers need to be part at the table. Paying, if we paid for just this mission critical data, you would know in a moment where the problems are, who's doing what. And I think the FDA is actually stepping up to the plate and participating in these trials. Honestly, if it hadn't been for Janet Woodcock at the beginning, there would have been no I-SPY 2 trial. And it was her idea about how to organize the master protocol. So I think that thinking about how to have early endpoints that are connected to late outcomes, thinking about optimal combinations, and open labeled if they're not industry sponsored and it's large and multiple arms. I think we have to think now about a hub and spoke model. We have to make sure our trials get to where patients are. And in the major medical centers that have the capability for research, because we've made it so complex, that's not where the patients are. So we have to open up our mind. We have to all step up and do something different and think about how we can make investigational pharmacies help sponsor other trials, and how other sites, and be your supervising sites, and make it easier for investigators to participate and not make it so difficult. And all of us have to embrace the idea that we should have mission critical data and an overlay of quality improvement systems that allow us to send that right back that data to the sites. And I am grateful to the FDA for supporting us on this concept of one source. Next slide, because that's actually what's helping us, define what's a standardized way of doing it. And it's something I hope that in a month we'll have operational. Why not try? So I think actually the silver lining to COVID is it really is forcing a change to business as usual. There is real urgency. But in fact, when I think about breast cancer, 40,000 women die every year. Why aren't we being more urgent about it in the same way? People have to collaborate. We have to focus on what matters most to care and research. We should automate our insights and get rid of these, try and minimize some of these soul crushing tasks. I think that's what you called them, Rob. And, get higher value out of what we do. Our accrual strategies have to adjust and adapt to disease. And we should focus on that minimum central data set and think about how we get it in. And everyone's going to have to play their part in enabling this to go forward so we can focus on what's best for patients. And yes, there may be a little bit of risk to solve critical health problems, but if we keep doing what we're doing, we are not going to get there. So we're trying to run an experiment. Mark, thank you for the help. We are intent on making it happen, and we'll see. If you don't try, you don't get there.
Thanks very much for the vision, the discussion of the obstacles and how to overcome them, and actually being willing to get in there and do it. Thank you very much for the presentation. So next I'd like to go to Pam Tennerts. Pam?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. So I have a few slides. I don't know if they're coming or not, but I limited them to two in the spirit of streamlining the efforts here. So I'm talking here today, and I'm happy to talk to you today about Citi's multi-stakeholder vision for clinical trials. And we created this vision prior to COVID coming on board. But it feels as if we in some ways foreshadowed all the needs that COVID would bring to us. And so it speaks to the core of this panel of having to have robust evidence to understand how we could possibly treat COVID-19 in this scenario. So like I said, it was completed by early 2020 before COVID. But we've seen how COVID, we knew what was going on with clinical trials, but COVID has sort of been the great revealer of all the things we've been needing to change, as Rob outlined and Laura outlined. And it's also acted as the great accelerator for change. So that is that same silver lining that some of us are seeing. And our vision is broader than just COVID trials, but it foreshadowed all the needs that we would have for COVID, for these practical trials, so they can be more common so we can do better and more trials. And like Laura said, it's not just for COVID. We really need to think about creating the same urgency and system for other diseases that require treatments just as much. So we recognize in our vision that some aspects will likely happen sooner than others, particularly in some countries, population, therapeutic areas, et cetera. And while our vision is intended to apply to clinical trials broadly, we did use the NIH definition, except we changed subjects to participants. So, and that might be something to think about. And we'll also actually analyze lessons learned down the road to see what is actually moving us closer to this vision, because COVID is actually moving us closer in many ways, or other trials that were affected and had to sort of switch midstream. And we're starting activities to bring us closer to that vision. And this morning I was talking to team leaders about embedding clinical trials in clinical care. And many of them are listening today. And this is really how we can learn from COVID to sort of bring the vision forward. So what is our vision? Next slide, please. And I brought here the high-level principles, and I pulled out some additional thoughts that relate to that practical trial idea, that if you think about it, a lot of diseases and areas could benefit from. So we felt that clinical trials have to be patient or people-centered and easily accessible. And what that meant to us, and I'm only mentioning a few, is that patients and patient organizations are fully integrated in the design and governance of clinical trials, and that the enrolled participants reflect the diversity of the population expected to use the medical product, which I think in COVID is made abundantly clear too. Clinical trials are designed with a quality approach. I think we've touched about that, and some previous panelists have touched about that, but clinical trials should address a clear and meaningful scientific questions, and it should be determined with the input and consideration of those who will be using the results, so that decision-making framework. They need to be fit for purpose, designed with study activities that are essential to ensure safety of participants and the credibility of the study results, and with non-essential activities eliminated in order to simplify conduct and improve trial efficiency. The protocol should be clear and concise, and inform consent materials as well. And the data collection should be easy and adequate and not excessive. And the validity of the analysis plan should be matched for the purposes of the trial. And as mentioned earlier too, where possible, infrastructure, and it doesn't have to be clinical trial infrastructure, any infrastructure should be reused. Next area is that clinical trials are fully integrated into health processes, so they should be integrated with learning healthcare systems, where science, informatics, incentives, and culture are aligned for continuous improvement and innovation, and then with best practices seamlessly embedded into the future clinical trials. Clinical data is collected via electronic healthcare record, with additional data only collected if it's unavailable. And informed consent for participation should be integrated into the care process. Next, we have that clinical trials maximally leverage available clinical, but also non-clinical data. And it should include data collected via digital technologies to minimize collection of necessary trial-specific data. What that means is that data has to be integrated, accessible, linked, and all of that should be straightforward. And while that is one sentence, that's really tough to do, I imagine, but that's what we need to strive for. And I think some of these COVID trials have paved the way in some of that already, and we should learn from that. And that the choices of data and the methodology should correspond to the level of evidence needed. And finally, we feel that clinical trials contribute to knowledge and should contribute to knowledge about how to prevent, diagnose, and treat diseases. And clinical trials are just one of the many sources of information that can be acted on to improve population health. And so it's exciting to see this all come together for COVID. Gusto was mentioned, that was the very first trial I ever participated in, and I feel I've been clawing my way back to sort of that simpler approach and integrated approach. And it sounds like with COVID, we're getting a little closer. And for City, we hope that in 2030, a whole lot of disease areas and a whole lot of clinical trials can be closer so that we can do more trials, because that's the goal. We need to have more trials so we can create more of that evidence that Rob talked about that is now lacking. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great. Pam, thanks for the presentation. Thanks for all that Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative is doing to try to advance these practical trial approaches systematically. Next, I'd like to go to Adrian Hernandez.
Okay, Mark. So thanks for having me here. And I'm going to share a highlight in terms of what's possible in the ambulatory setting. So if you go to the next slide. So just, one thing that's come up historically is there's been this gap between those who actually participate in research and those who actually want to. And so in general, only 2 to 4% participate in research, but yet like 80, 85% or 90% plus actually would like to join. And we currently have a system that's really passive. We actually don't know what people's preferences when they come through our systems or any environment. And so leveraging what's been learned and the challenges around clinical research and also trying to address the COVID-19 problem, we had the opportunity to do something different, and that was with the HERO program. This was a program funded by PCORI, leveraging PCORInet and partnered with Verily, where we could actually identify people and their preferences around participation in research. And so this program is focused on healthcare workers, people who are on the front line defending the issues around COVID-19. And importantly, you can't interfere with their daily lives. And so you have to fit into their daily lives as part of what they're doing for their workplace or at home. And so there are a couple of key components here where we're aiming to build a community of healthcare workers that could help understand and address directly COVID-19 issues regarding their health and outcomes, and then also importantly answer questions that were relevant to them. And so designing something with them and for them in a different way. And this becomes a platform where you can do multiple studies or multiple trials off. And so I'll share an example here next with the next slide. And so the idea here is that if you have people join a community, be able to participate, understanding their needs, their problems, and then learn from what they're wanting to address and putting forward trials that they may want to participate, then you have a faster circle of going through evidence generation. And then as you learn what's happening, then you can go back again and address other questions here. And I'll show 2 examples here in terms of how this has worked. So if you go to the next slide. So one thing that came up back in March and April, if people finally remember, there was a lot of enthusiasm about hydroxychloroquine. And so this was the first trial to really try to address this among healthcare workers at a scale that could actually address the question. And so in this case, there were thousands of healthcare workers who were concerned about their health. Hydroxychloroquine was a question that was out there. And so we were able to get people to sign up in this community and then understand their preferences of participation, their eligibility, and actually schedule them for randomization appointments. And so that's something very different where compared to our usual clinical trial paradigm, we just wait for people to come in and we so-called surprise them. Here's a trial for you, as opposed to actually understand what they want. And so through this, we're able to do something that facilitates rapid enrollment, be able to pre-screen in a safe environment off-site, schedule things so that they can have it at their convenience, including testing, randomization, and direct supply, and then have continuous follow-up through digital methods and also backup through telehealth methods. And so while hydroxychloroquine was the question here and still ongoing, you can also take this model and substitute other interventions around populations that have stated their preferences and are co-creating what the program should be. And just recently as an example where we actually asked healthcare workers what their preferences were for certain topics, they actually came up with an answer that was different than the investigators had. And so in a way, we could have gone down a pathway where we thought this important question was the right answer or the right question to address with the next trial. The community actually said the opposite. And so that helps guide the process going forward. Go to the next slide. I think that's it. So Mark, turn it back over to you.
Great, Adrian. And just, I think I know the answer to this, but that hydroxychloroquine trial in healthcare workers, that's still ongoing.
Yeah, so we're still ongoing. The DSMB met after the first 1,000 and said, keep going.
Mm-hmm. Well, it really highlights the importance of trying to get these additional sources of evidence. Thank you for all you're doing. Next, we're going over to David from Novartis.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I appreciate it. Thanks to the panelists, and thank you for the organizers for inviting me to the panel. I'm going to keep my comments really brief. I don't have any slides, thankfully, because the previous panelists actually covered all in their slides what I would put in my slides. So what I'll talk about a little bit is the industry view with respect to the need for continued innovation in cardiovascular medicine, and how COVID acted as a bit of a window into the possible for us in cardiovascular. So as Rob and Adrian know very well, well before COVID, years before, there was a bit of a crisis in innovation in cardiovascular medicine, and this was really driven by two factors. The first is cost. The large clinical trials, randomized clinical trials needed for regulatory approval in cardiovascular medicine are very expensive and time consuming. So on average, per patient cost for a clinical trial is somewhere around 10,000 to about 30,000 US dollars per patient randomized. And so you can quickly do the math on these multi-thousand patient trials and see that you're landing into some serious investment. The challenge, though, also comes with when you complete those trials, you're not guaranteed access at the end of the study. So you can complete a successful trial with your latest medicine, your latest innovation, and still the evidence hasn't been generated that convinces payers, health technology assessors, ex-US, or practitioners to start to use the medicine and adopt it into their practice. And so there's a gap typically between the randomized controlled trial and the evidence needed for uptake of the medicine later. So, when we talk about pragmatic trials, we've been working with Oxford Life Sciences on Orion 4, which is a study with inclisiran, partnered with the NHS and with the TIMI group, and then and looking at the efficacy of inclisiran to improve cardiovascular outcomes in patients with ASCVD. So a critical question, and this is being done in a very pragmatic way, so minimal data collection and so forth, to create a sort of a disruptive cost model for the trial. The second question, though, is around access. So the next part of the question is, do we actually have the evidence that we need from this trial to guarantee access on the other end? And what we're going towards more in the future is trying to marry these two concepts, right? So within our clinical trials, within our clinical studies, ensuring that we're collecting the right data or we're partnering with the right providers to be able to show that within their systems, the medicine is making a difference to their patients. So that's kind of where we're headed in terms of evidence generation in general. I would say, one thing to bear in mind is that from a global standpoint, when we consider not just, conducting trials in the US, we have to consider, how the data generation, data collection, and trial conduct can be globalized, not just in the US, but within other areas as well, so we can ensure that all the evidence requirements are met at the end of the day. So thanks a lot. Appreciate being here.
Thanks very much, David, for putting that in the broader context of cardiovascular disease. That's exactly kind of transition from COVID context more broadly that we wanted to focus on today. These have been some great presentations. We are about out of time for this session. I think just suffice to say that this is an area where at Duke Margolis, in collaboration with FDA, as you heard, with a lot of leadership there, and with some very motivated investigators and a broader community that seems to be coming together around the simple trial approach. We expect to see more progress in these areas in the near future, and certainly is needed for the urgent issues around COVID care that Laura and Rob alluded to, and definitely needed for addressing the worsening trends in cardiovascular outcomes and the need for improvements in other disease areas as well, as we have more and more data that can be combined into a much better totality of the evidence. Hopefully we can do a lot more building on these steps to take advantage of that opportunity. I want to thank all of our panelists for a great session on a topic that I think is a really critical one to have front and center on the real world evidence agenda going forward. And I would like to turn to Susan Dintzer, who's going to kick off our next session.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark. And let me echo your comments and saying that was a terrific session. We are now going to move to session 2, Transforming Outcome Capture, Advancing Routine Use of Digital Tools and Technology for Study Measurement. And in this session, we're going to discuss how we can use technology to capture data when patients cannot or do not interact with the healthcare system. Now, that might be because there are medical events that don't require a physician or hospital encounter, so they're not captured in the traditional data sources such as claims and EHRs. We also know there's been a very long desire to use remote monitoring and other technologies in trials under appropriate circumstances, whatever those may be, to bring trials to patients and to improve patient experience. Now, of course, the COVID pandemic has forced much more limited patient and provider interactions than is customary, and also advanced the use of digital tools such as sensors and technology, including remote monitoring and telemedicine and telehealth, to capture data. And this has happened in clinical trials where we would normally be capturing information from providers, but because of COVID, we cannot do that. So FDA has been actively responding by releasing 3 guidance documents of interest, conducting CT during COVID-19, remote monitoring in COVID-19, and PROs in the outpatient setting for COVID-19. But now we have to truly understand the performance of these technologies and whether they do measure up to the standard for regulatory decision-making. In some circumstances, these technologies are already incorporated, of course, into routine care and used to facilitate a learning healthcare system. But how do we demonstrate that the data collected in the real world setting in these contexts are fit for regulatory use? So let's go to the next slide, developing a roadmap, for developing study endpoints in real world settings. We explored understanding how to develop endpoints using digital tools to measure outcomes in this roadmap for developing study endpoints in real world settings. It's a paper that explores how key differences in study settings influence a researcher's considerations for developing study endpoints in the real world. Paper also addresses key considerations for the validation of real-world endpoints and examines opportunities to enhance the use of real-world endpoints through stakeholder collaboration. Now, this work obviously is especially important during the time of COVID-19, where we need to optimize the efficiency and the alignment of endpoints to facilitate timely answers related to potential treatments and maintain the continuity of trials that were initiated pre-COVID. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, we're going to move now to another conversation with 5 panelists who are here to speak with us about their work with novel data capture, including these digital health tools and technologies. And so let me go to the first of them. We're very happy to be joined by Nancy Dreyer of IQVIA. Nancy, as you see here, is the Senior VP and Chief Scientific Officer for Real World Solutions at IQVIA. And Nancy, over to you.
Thank you, and thanks everybody. What an exciting meeting you've organized, Duke Margolis. Thank you, and I appreciate being part of this panel. If you take me to the first slide, I want to use my 5 minutes wisely. Wanted to tell you about a direct-to-community effort that we have engaged in. This is a program that we launched on April 2nd in the United States, an active, adaptable community reporting system designed to study factors that influence severity and progression of symptoms. So how do you feel better faster? Wanted to point out that there are 3 big differentiators of this from many of the other work that you may be seeing. This is truly patient-centered. So this is about patients' perceptions of their symptoms and whether they worsen or improve over time, and we're accepting them regardless of test result. We know that lots of people haven't been tested, and we know that the tests aren't 100% reliable. Another unique feature of this is the use of alternate contacts. So we ask all people, once they volunteer and they consent, this is certainly a consented research program, but we do ask them for alternate contacts that we can get in touch with should we lose contact with them. And this is really our way of finding out if our volunteers have been hospitalized or died. So fortunately, we haven't had any deaths yet since we started, but it's a way to an early indicator of death. The last key point I want you to think about from this slide is if you look at these categories, things we evaluate, prescription and non-prescription meds, vitamins, herbals, minerals, underlying health conditions, whether you've tested positive or not, everybody on this call knows that this is a rapidly changing field. And we are using this registry and the whole registry concept to constantly, or better way to say, periodically review and update our data collection. For example, we are starting to ask, our next iteration or launch will be asking people if they've had a vaccine for COVID and which vaccine, also about flu vaccines. We're also going to think about extending our follow-up, which is currently 3 months now, but extended to 6 months or possibly 12 months because there's growing interest in long COVID. Next slide, please. We're actually running this program in 2 countries. We launched in the US, as I mentioned, on April 2nd, and then launched in the UK in July. This gives us a lot of advantages. First of all, the program is near real-time reporting from both of these countries. If you went on the website from either countries, you'd be able to see some statistics and information about the people who are participating, their symptom burden. We don't provide any information in real-time analytics about the treatments they're using because this is not intended to endorse or support any treatment until it's been evaluated. Instead, the way we work this is while we make data available in near real time, we do back-end data curation for creation of analytic data sets. So this has to be a very methodical process. For anyone who's worked in direct-to-patient work, you know that there can be bad actors and you have to weed them out. The other 2 points I wanted to make were the big bar on the bottom. We have some interesting opportunities, particularly in the US, for validation and augmentation through linkage with health insurance claims data. So about half our participants have been linked to some type of outpatient pharmacy prescriptions or medical care. This helps add to the data collection so we don't ask everybody about every medication they're taking, and also validates the reliability. And last, we have built-in generalizability evaluations because we get a hypothesis in the United States, we can test it in the UK. If it's a biological effect, it should be evident in both countries. I wanted to just wrap up that while this has been built and funded by IQVIA, we're pleased to officially welcome FDA as a sponsor. Thank you.
Great. Nancy, thank you so much. A really very interesting initiative. We're going to go on now to Leonard Sachs from the FDA. And Leonard, as you see there, is Associate Director of Clinical Methodology in the Office of Medical Policy at CDER at the Food and Drug Administration. So Leonard, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Susan, and thanks to Duke Margolis for the invitation. Nancy's given a good coverage of some of the sort of patient-reported aspects of these trials, and I'm just going to focus very briefly on a little bit more of the technological side to gathering data remotely from patients. I think most of you are aware that at FDA, we've been interested in digital health for many years. In fact, I was surprised to realize that it's already been 5 years since we published a Federal Register notice requesting input from the public in a docket on the use of mobile health technologies and other sorts of technologies for use in clinical trials. Digital health technologies have revolutionized our ability to gather health-related data directly from patients. They're being used extensively in clinical care. I do some of my clinical work at the VA, And I've grown accustomed to getting continuous results from patients using telehealth, recordings of their blood pressures, their glucose, pulse oximetry, weights, and so on. And clearly these sorts of measurements can be of considerable value in clinical trials. These technologies allow us to monitor patients from their homes. We can view continuous data recordings, which is something that we have not been able to do in traditional trials with snapshot visits. They also give us access to patients in remote locations. Think of rare diseases where patients are widely dispersed, and now they can all be brought together using electronic technology. They're also very useful for accessing patients who have trouble with mobility, either because they have musculoskeletal problems or cognitive problems, etc. And finally, probably most importantly, they will make participation in trials much more convenient. They allow us to make objective measurements of functionality. That was something that was really not possible in periodic study visits where we relied on patient reports and scores. They're also very important tools in decentralized clinical trials. They allow the acquisition of trial data to move from the study site to the patient's home. So the COVID-19 pandemic has put the spotlight on these tools, and everybody recognizes with the danger of in-person contact, FDA has emphasized the importance of patient safety and the advantages of moving trial-related activities to the patient's immediate environment. In our recent guidance on conducting trials during COVID-19, the importance of patient safety is paramount. And to ensure this, remote visits can be done and urgent protocol changes can be made to protect patients with subsequent notification of IRBs and FDAs. These changes can be made urgently. The guidance covers video interviews and visits with patients, and it also supports the use of electronic informed consent. It describes different approaches to deal with patients who are in isolation. So clearly there are scientific and there are practical issues that need to be dealt with before we can rely on the information from digital health technologies. And I will talk about the sort of landscape of those technologies in a few moments. We know, for example, that there's a lot of variability when we measure things like step counts with different commercial devices. So we need to make sure that the measurements that are made by these tools are validated, that the number of steps counted by an accelerometer is the same as the number of steps you would count if you were looking at the patient. When the measurements made by the DHT are used to determine efficacy of new medical products, it's important to make sure that these measurements are clinically meaningful. To measure or to quantify a change in step count of 5 extra steps per week is obviously not a reason to take a new medication. So the measurements made have to be meaningful to patients. And of course, we need to ensure that patients will be able to use their DHTs properly. And we need to make sure that their data are protected and confidential, which is an ongoing concern with all electronic data. So digital health technologies come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. On my first slide there, you can see I've divided them into biosensors and to interactive mobile applications. And the biosensors, or at least the examples I have there, cover a broad range of things that can be measured. Continuous glucose monitors, which give us continuous traces and are amenable to all sorts of analysis. We can look at areas under the curve, outliers, hypos, periods at certain glucose levels, etc. And definitely much richer data than a static measurement of hemoglobin A1C. Continuous ECG monitors are things that are the size of a Band-Aid. They can give a continuous read and pick up things that are rare and impossible to find in a clinic visit, things like arrhythmias or asystoles. Continuous blood pressure monitors, fall detectors, such as we have on the Apple Watch, which can be very useful in looking at patients with things like Parkinson's disease. We have smart pills that tell us when they've been swallowed, and actigraphy, which I don't need to embellish on. Among the interactive mobile applications, these range from relatively pedestrian things like patient-reported outcomes on a tablet to cell phone cameras, which can be used both to capture static images and video images to analyze movement. And then there are mobile applications that are creative and can be used to test things like coordination in Parkinson's disease. Is an application that has 2 buttons, and Parkinson's patients are instructed to tap them alternatively as rapidly as possible, and gives an assessment of movement, which correlates with other measurements. Just a comment about the brand new Digital Health Center of Excellence in CDRH. The center has embraced the use of digital health technologies to collect data in clinical trials as one of their program components. For the record, the others are mobile health devices, software as a medical device, and wearables when used as a medical device. But it brings me to the bottom line, which is my next slide. So why bother? Well, imagine this child with Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, a terrible fatal disease, as you know, causing progressive weakness in these boys and death in their teens. To participate in a clinical trial, this child would need to be taken out of school. A parent would need to take time off work. They would probably have to get onto a plane because the study centers for Duchenne's are few and far between. They would need to check into a hotel, get a taxi, wheelchair and all, arrive at the study site. And then after all this, the child would be asked to do the 6-minute walk test, a primitive, clumsy test where he gets put in a long corridor to see how far he can walk in 6 minutes. In this day and age, we can certainly do better. One of these days, COVID will be gone, but these problems will not. And we have exciting tools. We have accelerometers, gyroscopes, video recorders, and other remarkable sensors that promise to revolutionize the quality of our measurements and the convenience for our patients. So I believe this is an opportunity we cannot afford to miss. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Leonard. Very inspiring ending in particular to your comments. Thank you for putting it in that real human perspective. We're going to move now to Ernesto Ramirez of Evidation Health. Ernesto, you see there, he is the design lead for research and analysis on the learning team at Evidation.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. Really interesting presentation so far, and excited to share a little bit about what we're doing at Evidation. So I'm going to be sharing 3 different case studies that we have been working on, a variety of different studies that focus primarily on infectious disease and how we're bringing to light the power of decentralized research trials and decentralized protocols to come to bear on infectious disease in general. For those of you that haven't heard of Evidation, we are a new digital health organization primarily focused on bringing to light the invisible data that individuals are creating and contributing during the normal part of their everyday lives outside of the clinical setting. We work with a variety of biopharma partners, as well as government funding agencies and other digital health organizations to do interesting research around person-generated health data in the field. So yeah, let's go to the next slide and I'll dive right into our case studies. So our first case study is a novel decentralized trial that we conducted during the 2019-2020 flu season. We've actually wrapped up data collection on this study or in analysis. We were funded by BARDA and then ran the study in collaboration with a nonprofit partner named Adir that's based out of the Pacific Northwest. In this study, we were really interested in understanding what actually occurs in the real world when people are experiencing influenza. So we recruited, as you see here, 5,200 individuals to engage in daily symptom reporting. They were also able to provide us information about their healthcare experiences, whether or not they saw a physician, whether or not they received treatment. If they did have an infectious event or viral infection, they provided us information about their recovery, as well as any other factors related to their experience. They were also required to wear a connected wearable device, something that they had already owned. So this was a BYOD on the wearable device process. However, the novel piece of this study were that we used 2 at-home nasal swab diagnostic kits. So when a participant enrolled in the study, we sent them basically a kit package, which we called our Flu at Home package. And based off of how they reported their symptoms, they were told to actually take those kits. One of those diagnostic kits was sent to a lab for PCR so we could get an actual diagnostic value. and confirmed influenza A, B, or RSV. And the other was a rapid diagnostic kit that our nonprofit partner was testing. During the course of the 4-month observational trial, we had over almost 530,000 daily surveys were completed. We captured over 600,000 days of wearable data, and we had a little over 1,000 actual test kits triggered. For the test kits, we believe we're a little over 200 that actually have confirmed influenza A/B, and we're doing some actual additional testing to identify potential other viral infections in those individuals that were flu negative. Now, the great thing about this data is that it is going to become available. We're going to be putting it on the Synapse platform later on this year, so others can look at how people report influenza and the relationship between wearable data that we're collecting and actual influenza diagnosis. Next slide, please. Our second case study is something that we've been doing for a while now that we repurposed in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. So Evidation runs Achievement, which is a consumer platform of nearly 4 million individuals who engage in surveys, connect wearable data, and we use as a recruitment vehicle for a lot of our studies. For the last few years, we've been doing some large-scale influenza research, basically asking them weekly questionnaires about their symptom experience. When the COVID-19 pandemic hit, we repurposed our flu survey to include COVID-19 symptoms, and we've been doing some research to look at the relationship between person-generated health data and self-reported COVID-19 diagnoses. And you can see here we've got some interesting results. Obviously, resting heart rate is really interesting, and we see that it's related to a COVID-19 diagnosis. We also see some information or some information around how COVID-19 is different than influenza. This data is part of a publication that's now in press, or sorry, under review. Hopefully we in press soon. And this data will also be released publicly later on this year and then early next year. And then the last slide is something else that we're doing with our friends at BARDA. They've funded us to look at high-risk populations to really understand what's going on. So rather than just a general observational trial, this is a prospective trial where we're, again, sending kit sampling tests to an individual. We're gonna be having them do 8 tests over an 8-week period to really understand whether or not we can ascertain asymptomatic, pre-symptomatic, and symptomatic individuals. We're going to have them split between 2 different wearable arms, a commercial wearable and a clinical wearable. And again, they're going to be doing daily symptom reports, really trying to tease out here the role of wearable data in understanding COVID-19 and its ability as a prediction or diagnostic tool. So real quick, just wanted to go over those 3 quick case studies. Happy to talk a little bit more about them in detail during our Q&A session. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you so much. Again, very, very interesting case studies there. So we'll go now to Crystal Browning of Pfizer, and she is the Senior Director of Regulatory Affairs at Kaiser, as you see there. So Crystal, to you, please.
Hello, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today. So today I'm going to focus on a specific virtual clinical study that we're doing at Pfizer that incorporates a stasis dermatitis indication. So next slide. So many will ask, why do a virtual study? And Pfizer was thinking about this idea or this concept before COVID-19, and I think the aspects that I'm going to speak to today will help solidify why we need to continue these even during the course of this pandemic. So the reason why we want to is, number one, it reduces the patient burden, and we spoke to this in previous presentations. So, you know, patients can enroll in a current clinical trial due to the fact that they have mobility issues, that they may work, the caretaker situations. The other reason why we want to do a virtual or kind of a hybrid clinical study design may be the fact that sometimes it's hard to enroll the necessary patient population. Recruitment can be slow. But there's also the innovative technology that you want to utilize in these trials that you may not be able to do within a true brick and mortar site. And some other considerations that we may take into play here too, but that may not be applicable, is that it may cost a little bit differently. So thinking about all these ideas, there are 3 main aspects that we need to make sure that people take into consideration when deciding whether a site list design is appropriate. The aspects are the disease, the siteless design, and the drug characteristics. So when we thought about this, we looked at stasis dermatitis and why this was important. Stasis dermatitis, you have the inflammation below the knee, and there's a noticeable disease. You can see the disease on the skin. Also, it's also associated with elderly patients that have mobility issues, and there's also pain and itching. So the other concept is the efficacy endpoint. So we felt photography was important because the lesions or the skin discoloration is very noticeable on the skin. And then because there is pain and itching, we felt that it would be necessary to understand the quality of life associated with these patients by using a PRO. And then the last characteristic is looking at the drug itself. So we went with crisaborole. Crisaborole is an approved product that is approved globally. But what's important is that we already understand the safety profile of the product, and the patients would be applying it to a body surface area that we knew would have limited systemic exposure. And we're utilizing the drug as it's already approved USPI. So next slide. So here is the design of the 1038 study. It is a true virtual study. There are no sites for this study. All the patients are recruited through the internet, and there is a healthcare practitioner that comes to the patients to make sure that they're truly acceptable or allowed entry into the study. All of the visits from this point are televisits, and the drug is shipped directly to the patients, and the lesions or the photos of the lesions are taken by the patient. There's a couple of things that I want to state here real quick. It's not only just the FDA aspect, but it's also the state aspect as well. And sometimes the state legislation or rules or regulations can be a lot more stricter than the FDA. So what I say is that you make sure that you involve your legal, your regulatory, and your clinical and technology when you're looking at whether a virtual trial is appropriate. So on the next slide, this is the overall schema of the study. And we're going to go ahead and move forward to the next slide. So what we did is we went forward and we had a discussion with the agency. There were three main concerns that we had. Stasis dermatitis, there's not a lot of regulatory precedence for drugs or approvals, so we want to make sure that the indication was viable. The second thing that we wanted to make sure about is the study design, and just to make sure the efficacy, safety endpoints were appropriate for this patient population. And the third most important thing is the innovative measures. So we did reach out to the FDA. It did take them a while to respond to us because there was a lot of information that we requested feedback on. We did start the study, and they did respond to us. So they did once again indicate that the indication is appropriate. They wanted us to validate the photography that was used to assess the primary efficacy endpoint. And the other thing, too, is that they had other additional questions. So in conclusion, we did move forward with the study. We did respond to the FDA. And really the reasons why we did this study is, number one, we knew the drug was safe. The study design was appropriate for the innovative measures that we wanted to use. And lastly, what this example will do is provide us more information for utilization of virtual trials in the U.S., because we always see a lot of observational studies. So this is a great example to kind of move forward and give us some points for more pivotal marketing application submissions. And that's it. Back to you, Susan.
Terrific, terrific. Thank you so much, Crystal. We'll go now to Jennifer Goldsack, who's with the Digital Medicine Society and is the co-founder and executive director there. So Jennifer?
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Susan. And I'm going to start just a couple of remarks without any slides. My colleagues on the panel have done a tremendous job of sort of setting up what I hope will be some useful concluding remarks, really thinking about one of the questions that Leonard posed, which is why bother? And I think that when we think about these technologies, it's absolutely certain that the COVID-19 sort of public health crisis has been an accelerator. People have become more interested in using these technologies. It's perhaps changed the risk calculation that people make about involving these sorts of technologies in the sort of high-risk endeavor of medical product development. But there were pressing and persistent challenges that existed sort of long before the pandemic sort of hit our shores. I hope that we are able to get the public health crisis under control. And sadly, I fear that those pressing and persistent challenges will likely extend beyond the current public health crisis. We can think about the fact that sort of participant populations in clinical trials rarely looks like the populations we actually try and treat with those medical products once they're commercialized. My colleague from Novartis on the previous call mentioned the high cost of doing these sorts of trials. Health disparities have been absolutely at the forefront of everything we've seen with COVID, but yet we've known this to be the case for decades. It's just front of mind right now. And as, again, Leonard mentioned, some of the measures we use today are frankly lousy. That's not to sort of be offensive in any way, but there is absolutely room for improvement. And so, you know, I'm lucky enough to sit at the helm of a nonprofit organization called the Digital Medicine Society, but despite that, we're certainly not sort of tech determinists. Good progress using these digital tools doesn't look like more technology, more technology, more technology. It's how, you know, what is the high quality, person-centric, appropriate use of these technologies in clinical research to solve this laundry list of problems that we've been battling with within our field for decades now. And I wonder if we could just throw up a slide. There's a resource that I want to share with folks that we launched just a couple of weeks ago. Colleagues of mine at the Digital Medicine Society, along with experts at Electra Labs, Genentech, Connexa Health, Myocardia, Sage Bionetworks, and Scripps Research, launched what we describe as the playbook. It's intended to be the essential industry guide for sort of developing and deploying these digital clinical measures that we've been talking about in this session. And what I think is really important is we didn't decide to focus our efforts simply on clinical research, on clinical care, or public health. To us, our sort of mantra doing all of this work is a heartbeat is a heartbeat. And you know what? We're really going to mess things up if we start having a Pfizer heartbeat, an IQVIA heartbeat, a Mayo Clinic heartbeat, a CDC heartbeat. So for us, when we're using these technologies, when we're getting these digital clinical measures of health, they should transcend those silos. And in fact, if we are serious about using real world evidence that includes digital technologies, both from a more traditional trial that include them and from real world evidence, we need to start thinking about the fact that data doesn't live in manila folders anymore. Arguably, we have the opportunity to build a digital data ecosystem where we can access all different sorts of data captured in different settings. And we need to make sure that these digital measures look the same, are of equal quality, and can be used as needed in the service of health. And if we can just switch across to the next slide, one of the slides we have in the playbook, we call out our colleagues here at Margolix. Susan, you opened mentioning the terrific roadmap that actually Ernesto, I know your Evidation colleagues contributed to as well. And what was really nice is the roadmap was released about a week before we launched the playbook, and we sort of looked at it and were absolutely delighted to see that, you know, the work that you had done, the sort of core framework for thinking about extracting new endpoints from real world evidence married really well with what we were proposing about deliberately collecting data sets in order to develop these endpoints. We start with the person and a valuable measure that could actually solve a problem, and we develop it from there. So I'll leave my comments here and look forward to a great discussion. Thank you, Susan.
Terrific. Well, thank you to all of you really for some very important presentations and really surfacing some of these novel methods of engaging patients and conducting clinical research as you've conducted. I think consistent across what all of you said are some very common themes. First of all, these technologies exist today. They will be different in the future, but they exist today. So technology is not the rate limiting factor in conducting clinical research this way. You've all talked about the enormous opportunities to address any of a number of challenges that are inherent in other clinical trial settings. First of all, getting access, especially across broad geographies, dealing with the mobility challenges that various patients may encounter. You've talked about how the pandemic really did change the risk calculation with respect to the use of these technologies, and how if there had been concern prior to the pandemic that these technologies or engaging patients this way might not be optimal, you had to set those reservations aside to get any research done in the setting of the pandemic. And therefore, we have had this dramatic change in the risk calculations, as you said. And you've obviously all addressed in various ways the issue of cost, how much cost reduction we could have if you have, in effect, sightless trials going on. And basically are able, obviously, to make those potentially of much broader reach and engage patients much more actively than heretofore. So clear emphasis on all the opportunities. Let's talk in our remaining time about challenges that you think you either have encountered in your examples or that you think continue to be an issue across all of your examples. Couple that I heard at least tangentially discussed, usability of these technologies by patients. Now, clearly, many patients are very, very tech savvy, but not all are. Do you have a sense that use of these kinds of technologies, particularly in voluntary enrollment situations, is going to skew the population of patients that you get participating? And if so, how do you address that? That would be one topic I would love to hear you address. The other clear issue that we heard addressed just a few moments ago is you might have very different state level regulations governing the use of these in the United States. I imagine there may be some differences in other parts of the world as well as between national authorities and local authorities. How big an issue is that, and how would you recommend others who want to think about these novel approaches address those issues? So let's go first to this issue of usability of technologies by patients. And again, whether that is going to skew the results in some way.
I'm happy to add a little bit of context here. It's something that we think a lot about. Obviously, we have a nice, large, what we think is the largest US-based connected cohort in our achievement population. But that is primarily a BYOD approach, people that already have these type of devices that are comfortable at least somewhat using these tools. And we see representation across a variety of demographic factors: age, sex, race, ethnicity, even socioeconomic status and geography. However, that doesn't mean that everyone is in there and everyone is represented. And it's something that we actually are launching a new project with the RAND Corporation and USC. We have a new R01 that's primarily explicitly looking at underrepresented use of digital health technologies. I think what we've seen to date is primarily a focus on people that already have them, or people that are willing to use them connected to like academic centers, academic research. So they're close to those places. And what we're going to be using is RAND's American Life Project, which is a nationally representative cohort, and going out to people that typically do not use digital health technologies and trying to understand what about those are usable or not usable, and how that data that comes from these individuals is similar or dissimilar from our typical participants in these type of decentralized mobile health or digital health trials. So I don't know if we have an answer yet, but I think it's something that we need to do more research, obviously, and we're really excited about the potential there.
Great. And Ernesto, what is the timeline for that research?
That is a 4-year project. However, we should be having results. There's a multiple aims as part of the project. Part of them are data science. One of the things we want to learn is how to deal with missing data and how missing data might be differently, and how we deal with generalizability when there is non-representative data available to us. But we're hoping that we'll be launching data collection early in 2021, and then doing 1 year full data collection for that project.
Leonard, how does the FDA think about this issue?
I think inclusivity is a very important consideration. We obviously don't want to exclude populations from trials that have valuable data to contribute. My personal view is that the problem is not the patients who can't use the devices, is that the devices aren't correctly designed. And I think it's very important for us to focus on getting devices that are very easy to use and that don't limit the ability of patients to use them. I'm optimistic. As I mentioned when I spoke briefly earlier on, I've seen the use of these things in my patients at the VA, mobile blood pressure monitors and continuous glucose monitors. And these are patients who are not particularly wealthy or educated, etc. and the data are extraordinarily useful and reliable. So I'm optimistic about these. I think one has to focus on good design, and I think technology now is sufficiently plastic that designs can be made to be very user-friendly. But again, I think, we do have to check that we have access to the correct patient samples. We don't get skewed sampling.
Is FDA engaging any of the tech developers on this question of making their devices as usable as possible for patients?
No, I don't think we have a sort of an avenue for direct engagement, but we do have interactions with various vendors as they come to discuss their devices with us. So I think that's been a platform for us to encourage this. I think just in talks such as these, I think people get this information from us. But I think vendors are the first to recognize that usability is one of the most important things.
Others of you want to comment on that or surface other challenges that you think need greater attention?
Yeah, so I just want to speak real quick. Stasis dermatitis does have an impact on older patient population. So we do have older patient population, I call them the wiser ones, utilizing the technology within the study itself. But I think the most important thing is, number one, there's a training aspect of using the technology. But the other part is when you have issues, you should be able to fix those issues or make suggestions or change those issues within the clinical trial. So I think that will help because you're getting that real world experience back that you need to be able to, as an organization, fix the situation and move it forward so you continue the usage of that technology.
Great. Thank you, Crystal. And by the way, you were the person who mentioned the issue of state regulations potentially differing and actually differing from what the FDA may require. Say a little bit more about that. In addition to engaging one's in-house regulatory experts on that, what ought people to be aware of?
Well, that could be a job within itself to understand the different state legislation, and that's why we would need our legal representation to help with that, because they can understand the different nuances between each state. So what you have to do is just make sure that you have a great legal representation that can tell you, there's certain regulations around telehealth, around the informed consent. You just have to make sure you have the necessary support so you know those nuances.
Great.
Susan, if I can, I'd just like to pile on for a second here, and I want to riff off one of Ernesto's comments around, I'm not sure we really have the answer yet. One of the things I struggle with a little bit here is, your question was around, goodness, could this skew our population, or could it be skewed much more than it is now? And so one of the things I struggle with is, are we holding these digital technologies to a higher standard? It's not particularly good right now. Should we hold these digital tools back because we believe that they can reach something? And that's where I struggle, frankly, because on the one hand, I think that these technologies offer sort of huge promise today, immediately. But I think there are genuine concerns around sort of digital literacy, access to these technologies if we're relying on BYOD models. And so, where I typically fall down, I think, is hoping that we can sort of grab the benefits we can today while not absolving ourselves of the fact that, clinical trials are often not representative. And I believe that if we're thoughtful about the way we use digital tools, that can help ameliorate it. So not holding back the sort of wave of technology until it's perfect, but also not coming off the gas as we expect to use them to try and ameliorate, as I said, some of those pressing and persistent challenges. And I may make Leonard cringe, but one of the things I actually really like is, where appropriate, using high quality consumer technologies, because they've invested millions of dollars in making them as easy to use, as appealing to the broadest population possible. And so, obviously we need to do our due diligence to ensure that the data that comes off them is appropriate, that they have appropriate security and sort of data rights, sort of controls, so on and so forth. But I really like those. And then Susan, you did ask about, is there anything else? We think a lot about disparities in sort of how folks may be able to interact with the technology. I also think a lot about what about the algorithms, right? Who are these algorithms trained on? Is that representative? And so it's easy for us who perhaps aren't data scientists to focus on the thing we can see, but I think we need to focus on the whole stack and give each piece equal importance.
Great. Well, I want to thank all of you. Again, very, very compelling presentations. You've obviously, as I said earlier, emphasized a lot of the opportunities and pointed out that even though we may have questions, often we're judging these digital interventions against an idealized standard that does not exist currently in how clinical trials are conducted. So you've made that very important point, all of you, and thank you for your time today. I'm going to hand things over now to the moderator of our next session. That's Jeff Allen. He's the president and CEO of Friends of Cancer Research. So Jeff, over to you.
Great, thank you, Susan, and thanks to all of the panelists from session 2 on a great session regarding digital data capture, which I think will set us up very well for this third session today, as evidenced by our prior speakers about the amount of collective learning that's going on. The third session today will focus on collaborating to build a better real-world data infrastructure for enhanced post-market evidence. As Susan said, I'm Jeff Allen, President and CEO of Friends of Cancer Research. We've had the good fortune of working with a number of the speakers today on several oncology initiatives that hopefully have been a little bit of a pressure test that will lead into some of the discussions today around how this is being applied into address areas like COVID-19. Just as a quick introduction on the next slide, what we've seen very rapidly, perhaps in COVID-19 more than any other situation in recent history, given the rapidity of different trials that are going on in the utilization of emergency use authorization, just the need for having a robust infrastructure in place to be able to think through data collection in a very methodical way in order to continue the learning that will be necessary and balance the speed at which some of these products need to be able to become available and the continued learning that needs to occur as things move forward. So this slide depicts a number of different collaborative opportunities really that could come from leveraging various different sources of data, whether that be secondary uses through things like electronic health records or claims data, which have the ability to address different questions differently, or even aggregating that with other primary collection methods and thinking about ways that as a greater community that has been really demonstrated to come together in COVID-19 to think about some ways to jointly solve some of these problems, perhaps in a more rapid and robust way than each individual component could. So today we'll hear from participants from initiatives from large-scale collaborations like the COVID-19 Evidence Accelerator, the COVID-19 Healthcare Coalition, 4C, and other efforts that are underway that are really operationalizing some of this collaborative research. What you'll hear about from our participants today is how these different multi-stakeholder efforts have been able to think through things like standardizing diagnosis and outcomes definitions as a starting point for research, thinking about prioritizing research questions together, leveraging the different data sources to be able to address some of those questions in the most appropriate manner, and ways that things that different federated or parallel analyses can help reinforce the observations that are seen, with the idea being that replication of results may improve the confidence in those findings. So I know that we are running up against the clock here and we have great speakers to hear from. So I want to turn to them very quickly here to get us started in the session. First, I want to introduce each of the panelists that are here with us today. First is Susan Winkler, who is the CEO of the Reagan-Udall Foundation for the FDA. We'll also hear from Brian Anderson from the MITRE Corporation, Solomon Ayasu from Merck, and Griffin Weber from the Harvard University. Each panelist, like the others, will share a couple of minutes of introductory remarks, and hopefully we'll have some time to hear from them more in the open discussion. So without further ado, Susan, I'll turn things over to you.
That's great. Thanks so much, Jeff. And I'll have to say, since it's nearly 3 o'clock on a Thursday, I feel like we should be on an evidence accelerator call. And so I so appreciate the invitation to be here today and to share some information, a snapshot about the COVID-19 Evidence Accelerator, and appreciate John Concato's reference to it earlier today, and I will give you a little more detail about it. If we go to the next slide. So the COVID-19 Evidence Accelerator was created by the Reagan-Udall Foundation for the FDA in collaboration with Friends of Cancer Research. So I do have to say a thank you, Jeff, for working with us on this project. And we created it at the request of FDA. We created it with a twofold purpose. The first was to convene the COVID-19 real-world data, real-world evidence community to share, to test ideas, to discuss what people were learning, so that if we learned something in one situation, we could apply it in others and not require everyone to learn it over and again on themselves. We do that with a series of routine meetings, usually for the therapeutic side, 3 o'clock on Thursdays, where the community comes together and shares different ideas. The second approach or purpose of the COVID-19 Evidence Accelerator is to pursue prioritized research questions in a particular format. Right now, we have 4 research questions that are active, 3 related to therapeutics, from hydroxychloroquine, remdesivir, to the natural history of coagulopathy, and then 1 related to diagnostics and the real-world performance of some of these COVID-19 diagnostic tests in the market. We pursue the research in what we call a parallel analysis format, and this was, I think, generated by Friends of Cancer Research for research in oncology, and we apply it here, where we have multiple analytic partners with different data sources, electronic health records, pharmacy claims, health insurance claims, and we align on a common analytic plan. We allow the partners to run that plan and then share their results back, and we present those results in a shoulder-to-shoulder format. We've learned quite a bit in this process since launching in mid-April. The first is it takes time, and we're moving quickly, so it's faster than the things that we've talked about earlier in this meeting, but it takes longer than we had hoped, but we're getting faster. Requires a different approach depending on the data source, if it's electronic health records or claims, and that sometimes you have to build the system as you are proceeding forward. So if we go to the next slide, I'll just give you a quick example of a dilemma that we're addressing in the Evidence Accelerator, and this happens to relate to trying to connect data related to diagnostic tests. And we have here in the center Heidi, our hypothetical patient, and she has had a series of COVID-19 diagnostic tests if you move from the left to the right, and including a hospital admission. What is important about Heidi being at the center here and all of these diagnostic tests, if we want to look at the real world data that Heidi herself has generated about those diagnostic tests, the black dot at the top that goes from the left to the right shows that when the test was given and at the instrument level, we know exactly what test was given. But as the data moves to the results that she gets and then to the EHR, we lose that specificity. So we know whether the test was positive or negative, but we don't know which test was performed. And if we're trying to look at a structure to evaluate the real world performance of these, it becomes difficult if you don't have that information. So we're aspiring to connect these dots, and our perfect world for Heidi has the information flow all the way through, or at least a way to connect the information so that we can generate helpful evidence. If we go to the final slide, I'll just note that the community has developed a set of principles by which we operate. I would say, to overuse a phrase, none of this is rocket science, but speaks to how we operate within the Evidence Accelerator community and conduct our work. With that, Jeff, I'll go ahead and hand it back to you. And again, so appreciate the opportunity to be here today.
Great, thank you, Susan. It's been such a pleasure working with you on this project and with all of the accelerators. And as proof as to what a superhero you are, I know you're currently hosting another meeting for the Accelerator, so thanks for joining us today. And we know that you will have to run a little bit early. But for now, we are going to hear next from Brian Anderson, who is the Chief Digital Health Physician at MITRE. Brian?
Great, thanks, Jeff. And Susan, I apologize in advance for missing the Evidence Accelerator meeting that's going on right now as well. So as Jeff mentioned, I have the pleasure of being the Chief Digital Health Physician at MITRE and also the National Program Manager for the COVID-19 Healthcare Coalition, which started back in mid-March. MITRE's role was one of facilitation and enablement, pulling together a group of private industry stakeholders that wanted to align around their own capabilities, being in a group and synergistically addressing collectively some problems in the COVID-19 specific space. We have 3 specific work groups that look at leveraging real-world data, real-world evidence around diagnostics, therapeutics, and natural history, much like the Evidence Accelerator. One of the really exciting opportunities that began to develop as we pulled in a number of these stakeholders were the inclusion of the major EHRs, Epic, Cerner, Athena Health, ECW, Allscripts, and several others. As many of the panelists have mentioned on this call, the pandemic has broken down a lot of the barriers that have existed in the competitive landscape that we all work in. And the opportunity to meet 3 times a week in these work groups with these stakeholders that in any other place would be fiercely competitive, to share openly, to explore together some of these questions that are critical for the nation to answer in those domains was really refreshing, invigorating, and very much like what Susan described. Some of the things that we embraced were I know Dr. Abernathy has said it this way: ruthless transparency. So understanding that we don't know what we don't know, but we're going to commit to being open and frank and honest with one another as we dive into our own individual data sets, be you a Cerner or an Epic or an individual health system. And also that we're going to embrace and explore that together. We're going to iterate on this as we go. And those were some of the main tenets that we held on to as we explored into the space. And so some of the work that our coalition members engaged on were, again, as I mentioned, looking at some of the therapeutics, including those that some of the Evidence Accelerator has looked at: hydroxychloroquine, famotidine, convalescent plasma, the natural history of COVID-19, and some of the correlations for prediction of risk associated with that. And so, what did we learn? I think, some of the high-level things that I would encourage us collectively to think about, both as we, continue to live in this pandemic and explore what it might mean embracing the new normal, is these real-world evidence, real-world data coalitions are most powerful when they include groups from multiple stakeholder categories. So EHR vendors, of course, is a very powerful group to include people from the major EHRs that I had mentioned, but also health systems, researchers, IT team leads from the actual health systems that know how the data is gathered, how it's structured, and how it's used within the individual instance of that EHR at those health systems. And we have found in the work, for example, that we've done both in convalescent plasma and in famotidine, including those researchers, was incredibly helpful. Data scientists, as smart as they are at an EHR vendor, can only get you so far. And so including the PIs of various research studies in that collective group that's meeting 3 times a week was really helpful in helping to guide and answer some of those questions that we discovered we didn't know that we even needed to answer as we went through the process. The other, I think really important thing that we learned was a lot of the very basic things that we thought everyone agreed upon, we didn't agree upon. Susan had mentioned one there around kind of the traceability of manufacturing status or who the manufacturer is. You know, I would posit that even more basic than that, things like admission date or ventilation status or ethnicity, as you explore across EHR vendors, and become incredibly difficult, but incredibly important. And so one of the specific things that our group did is in those regular working group meetings, we committed to an open process of an agreed upon master protocol where we had agreed upon definitions as and getting down from the narrative level of, you know, for example, what are the ethnic categories, but a codable, queryable logic structure that could be executed within each of the data assets of our partners. And that proved to be incredibly hard. Creating the constraints and the value sets, we really had to pull in a lot of informatics muscle. It was helpful to have members from health systems and terminologists and various stakeholders help develop those kinds of master protocols and technical guides that we were ultimately then able to align on. It was incredibly hard though. And so I think the last thing that I think we all have come to appreciate is the importance in advocating for standards. In the earlier session, we had heard about different devices, and one heartbeat on one device shouldn't be a different kind of heartbeat on a different device. Well, the same applies to real world data and EHRs. Standards that are open, standards that are interoperable, of course, FHIR, and agreed upon ways of growing that outside of or more than the US core, right? I also have the pleasure of working with many of our friends in the cancer space on M-Code, which is a project that tries to take that to a domain-specific level of oncology. That's what M-Code is about. COVID, I think we have the same kind of opportunity of developing disease-specific, agreed-upon, codable data sets and data models that will allow for greater interoperability and greater clinical impact derived from that interoperability. And so, you know, those are some of the lessons that we've learned, and I'm incredibly excited to hear the rest of the speakers here. Jeff, back to you.
Thanks, Brian, and congratulations on so much progress that you've been able to facilitate to date. Next, we're going to go on behalf of 4C over to Griffin Weber, who's the Associate Professor of Medicine and Biomedical Informatics in the Department of Medicine at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center and the Department of Bioinformatics at Harvard Medical School. He's also a technical lead for the Consortium for Clinical Characterization of COVID-19 by EHR, or as I mentioned, 4C. Griffin?
Thank you so much for that introduction. Again, it's also really great to be on this panel at this meeting. And as you'll hear, some of the challenges we face have also been faced by others. Can we move to the first slide, please? So for the last 15 years, I've helped develop an open source platform called I2B2. It's informatics for integrating biology at the bedside. This is a software program that allows researchers at institutions to be able to query, analyze, and visualize the data in electronic health records or claim databases. Zach Kahane is the PI of this. It's now used at over 200 hospitals worldwide, and we have data on more than 100 million patients across these I2B2 instances. Back in March, Dr. Kahane sent out an email to the informatics experts who run these different I2B2 systems to say who wants to work on a COVID project. And on our first meeting, we had over 100 people join our Zoom call, and we formed the Consortium for Clinical Characterization of COVID-19 by EHR, or 4C. We agreed to 4 main principles. Most of us were involved in many other large informatics projects to study COVID. I'm involved in N3C, which was mentioned earlier, another national NIH effort called ACT that connects various EHRs across the country. But all these different large programs are going to take months to build. So we want to know, can we, just digging into our data, get some early intelligence out, which may be worth more than complete intelligence later from these other tools. In order to do this, we knew we had to reduce barriers. So the way 4C works is that we run local analyses. We develop database scripts, or R scripts we run on our own EHRs, and then all we share are the aggregate counts that come out of those. Because we're not sharing patient level data, it avoids a lot of the IRB and regulatory challenges that we have in other projects. We generated these simple CSV text files that we uploaded centrally and visualized through various techniques. We share. We share with each other all of our raw data, these visualizations, and we have these at least weekly Zoom meetings where we all, 100 of us, stare at these different graphs, and we go through and look at all the little blips and missing information over there, and we try to figure out what was the issue and go back to the sites to clean that up. And that's really our secret sauce, being able to engage the local informatics experts to iteratively improve the data quality so that we trust what we're getting and we're more confident in the results that come out of it. Through this approach, it only took us 1 month to get our first preprint out. We looked at laboratory trends in over 27,000 COVID patients across 5 countries, and now we're looking at more complex analyses in our phase 2 of this study. There are a number of lessons we learned about our own data as part of this project. For example, the types of COVID lab tests and codes that hospitals use were constantly changing, especially early in the pandemic, which made it very difficult to harmonize across institutions. We learned that European hospitals do not collect data on race, so that limited some of the types of analysis we could do. And identifying which patients are in the intensive care unit is difficult because hospitals were repurposing floors as temporary ICUs, so they may not be coding these properly in electronic health records. Because each hospital handles these kind of issues differently in their EHRs, having the local data experts was really key on the Zoom calls in order to figure out how to combine the data and to understand what we could and also what we could not do with the data that we were collecting. Our work on 4CE is helping us improve other COVID informatics efforts that we are all working on. So although we're getting some it's a very manual process of getting these quick results out, it's feeding into the larger informatics projects that will serve as a more robust and scalable approach to studying COVID in the future. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Griffin. And our final panelist today, I want to turn things over to Solomon Ayasu from Merck, who I don't believe is using slides, but I'll hand the mic over to you, Solomon.
Okay, great. The video, I think I'm not able to turn it on. Somebody can turn it on. In any case, let me start by thanking the organizers for inviting me to this panel. I think this is a timely topic to discuss as we're grappling with COVID-19 and the data infrastructure that needs to be addressed to answer a number of the critical questions. So I think, what we're facing is an avalanche of different data sources that contain some information that is related to COVID-19 and the disease and therapeutics. There are many data offerings that we're evaluating almost real time. Some of them have variable quality, size, and geographic diversity. Some have access to rapid refresh data on online platforms for rapid queries, while others allow some limited downloads to the data, including the identified patient level data for sort of additional deep levels analysis. But what this has really pressured us to do is really to have a systematic way of ensuring use of high quality real world data that's fit for purpose. And that has become such a priority that we're almost forced to catalog all the different potential data sources and really put them through a prioritization and a deep quality check metrics. And therefore, even in our setting, to answer the critical questions about the disease and endpoints, we're trying to establish an ability to verify the source data, coding practices, data processing, transformation, how missing data was handled, the data linkage issues around the different offerings that we're seeing. In short, really establishing the data provenance and a transparent documentation, the historical record of the data and its source. And we're reminded constantly, about not doing the due diligence because of Surgisphere story that illustrates failure to authenticate the source and quality of the underlying data can really lead to disastrous consequences. However, we also recognize that there are trade-offs between patient data privacy and the common good of having a verified data which is high quality. It does present ethical and privacy concerns when we're trying to do the deeper dive. We're going to the source data. But there are newer technologies, newer methods that we're exploring as well, and everybody should explore in terms of privacy preserving analysis and data tokenization that can solve some of these challenges, including enabling the long-term follow-up of trial subjects who have undergone therapeutic trials, either for vaccine or for drugs, or they've had a vaccine administered to them in a clinical trial setting. So at the core of this, I would say, is really making sure that we have a fit-for-purpose data, reliable, relevant, and complete. And we're sort of juxtaposing all those quality metrics that we're setting up and matching them with the specific questions that are really critical to answer, either a trial planning exercise or even endpoint strategy, and also preparing really for the important work of a post-market surveillance system that could continuously evaluate the safety and effectiveness, and including real-world endpoints related to long-term outcomes. And this is really, the emergence of this data also has really endangered a positive collaborative interaction with data vendors and with data sources, healthcare systems, and I think the COVID pandemic and the need to answer critical questions in a pandemic setting has really galvanized sort of more collaboration among all these different entities. The second thing I would emphasize, at least from my experience, is that ensuring the application of high quality research and methods to establishing evidence. The pandemic really does require us to produce evidence quickly, but I think the pandemic setting should not absolve us from having and applying the usual high standards of research, evidence generation activity in the practice of evidence-based medicine. And I take note of the lessons from the rapid adoption of unproven therapies such as hydroxychloroquine and convalescent plasma as treatments, and the ethical and clinical controversies that ensued as evidence from a controlled clinical trial slowly emerged that challenge initial beliefs based on less rigorous science. And then the third area that would be of importance, I think, is the pandemic has laid bare the underlying racial and ethnic disparities in the impact of COVID-19 and its adverse outcomes. And therefore, just making sure that we understand really the natural history and the trajectory of the disease by different subgroups. Any therapeutic and vaccine development program should have diversity and inclusion as an important component of the research program. And this is largely going to be really driven by our understanding and utilization of high quality real-world data, and making sure that we have an approach that optimizes the diversity of the trials. And then the last point perhaps is, I think tying it to what we're talking about today is having a robust post-approval real-world data infrastructure for surveillance and evaluation of safety and effectiveness of the therapies or vaccines that are developed is a necessary component of the evidence continuum. This could include dedicated post-market real-world data studies or longer-term real-world data follow-up of trial subjects, and there are methodologies to do that. Some of the key questions that would be critical to answer that are really related to shortcomings of a trial, which are short, selected population, and also not long-term follow-up and small, may not enable sort of some of the rare safety events that are serious, or even give us a window into our ability to assess long-term safety outcomes of therapies and vaccines. Another concern with vaccine that we're taking into consideration in developing vaccines is also the potential for enhanced disease with re-exposure to virus. And then thirdly, I would say non-respiratory disease impact like cardiac glaucoma, and then cardiovascular outcomes or long-term sequelae of the disease, and our ability to impact through therapies those are outcomes that are consequences of disease. And we need to have a robust infrastructure to be able to measure, assess, adjudicate, and be able to really consider it as a comprehensive program in therapy development. And then the last I would say about vaccine is really the very important question of establishing a robust infrastructure for post-approval follow-up and to assess durability of protection, immunity, and then whatever differences there might be by demographics, whether it's you're looking at children or elderly or people with comorbidities. So these are important questions just to address, and we're learning a lot, about what we can learn from real-world data and what we can't really learn, and what enhancements that we can do to really inform the space. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I think you've each described how it's important to, and the efforts that you all have taken to do this as a community together. So I want to ask a question to each of you. Maybe we'll just go in the order that we went through speakers, just really quickly. So as has been noted through the discussion, it's not like real world evidence is a particularly new science per se, although it seems like it is getting a lot of attention, perhaps by necessity, in the efforts to learn more quickly about COVID-19. So my question to each of you is number one, was this the direction that the field was headed anyway, or was this sort of galvanization something that was able to occur due to the presence of an emergency? Would this type of cross-sector collaboration and unification around several of the aspects that you mentioned today have happened without an emergency? And second to that, what are some of the top lessons that you think will transcend and stick with us post-pandemic? So Brian, you mentioned collaboration across competitors in many ways. So let me start with you around whether you think this will happen and what lessons we can take with us into the future.
Yeah, I think to answer the first question, I think this was afoot prior to the pandemic. Some of the interoperability standards that were, announced in, starting really notably for me, at least back in 2015, and moving forward, I think laid the groundwork for this kind of federated, pre-competitive, I'll call it, approach where groups come together and agree upon, this is what we're going to call X, this is what we're going to call Y. And then to begin, I think more recently, an approach layered on top of that of researchers and subject matter experts in real world data coming to the table and saying, okay, now that we have that agreement, here's how we're going to conduct observational, retrospective, or prospective research, leveraging those kinds of standards. And I think that was happening prior, and I think certainly the pandemic accelerated it. I think where is it going? I think that, I think the next layer is one of traceability and provenance, and taking the agreed upon standards that we've begun to identify, certainly in the pandemic, but elsewhere in oncology and other spaces, and provide that kind of transparency into where that data came from, which I think is really one of the missing elements for real world data, real world evidence for regulatory approval. I think when we get into that space, things like digital health cards that have come out for immunization and vaccination status, incredibly exciting space of where we're taking standards and leveraging real world data to have a greater impact on traceability of distribution of tens of millions, hundreds of millions of vaccines.
Griffin, let me turn to you. Has the pandemic accelerated your efforts, and will the focus stick around?
It changed the focus a bit. There were issues in the past with real world data that we kind of ignored a bit that were emphasized by COVID. So for example, there's usually a lag between the electronic health record data and the data warehouses that I work with. So the data may be a month or two old. And usually that isn't such a big problem because we're looking at several past years worth of data. But with COVID, because it was changing so quickly, if you had a month or two old data, you were missing the entire wave. So we had a lot of work to do to change how we were pulling data out of these systems to get the most up-to-date data as possible. Similarly, there's code harmonization. How do you map one hospital's code to another? You usually have some time to do this. You'll do an annual update of that, for example, but we were having different codes every week that were coming out, and hospitals were on different timelines on how they were doing it. So some of the work we had to do in code mapping was greatly accelerated in this particular use case. There are other examples like that where in the typical use cases we usually have more time and some of these issues aren't as big a deal. But when we're faced with a very rapidly changing crisis like this, we had to change the approach we were doing. We also saw that it was really critical to bring together teams that had both the informatics people as well as statisticians and clinicians. We each brought to the table different types of expertise, and we needed all three of those to understand what was going on in the data and figure out what kind of research questions to ask.
Great. Solomon, for the quality measures metric that you mentioned, will they stick around?
The quality measures?
The approaches that you described around improvement for data and integrity, will some of the practices that you mentioned, do you think carry on post-pandemic?
Right. I think, this is sort of something that has been building over time. We've had, the communities that had a lot of experience in assessing safety using real-world data, basic epidemiologic principles and pharmacoepidemiology and data science. What this new area has, new sort of endeavor has really put focus on ensuring the quality of the underlying data and matching it to the question in hand. So this idea of fit for purpose. And secondly, what has accelerated really is the space beyond safety, really, into effectiveness of therapies or other modalities of treatment, and how do we derive evidence that is actionable and that we can actually depend on to make decisions, especially in the regulatory setting. So I think a number of, and then there's also a greater emphasis that is going on quality data, for other purposes beyond sort of regulatory or beyond sort of therapy development, really in the payer and other communities where evidence, real-world evidence is of high demand, and ensuring that that is also of high quality. So I would say it's a emergence of many different pressures, but I think that certainly the COVID situation has accelerated our focus in this area. And I think the quality metrics and high demand for provenance, establishing provenance of data, is here to stay.
Right. I want to follow up on the comment that you made around the development that MITRE's been taking around development of master protocols. Obviously something that's been talked about for quite some time in oncology anyway, from a clinical trial standpoint, now being applied to real world data. We've done some exercises with various stakeholders in oncology as well. Now that this has been pressure tested a little bit in oncology and in COVID-19, do you see this master protocol approach as something that will be informative to other therapeutic areas moving in the near term?
Absolutely. I'm incredibly excited. If there's one thing in the real world data space that I'm really excited about, it's the application. It's the development of master protocols in a federated model that allows for the rapid scaling of it in an observational way to provide some statistically significant potential signal for efficacy to help inform, prospective RCT design or different hypotheses for prospective, a very expensive prospective RCT. I think that is here to stay. I think that's going to become part of the process of developing an RCT almost, is this kind of master protocol development, leveraging a federated approach or centralized with different data assets to identify what needs to be the primary endpoints, how they're measured, for any prospective RCT. So I view that as one of the shining examples of how we can come together and agree upon a process moving forward. A lot of the work that the Friends of Cancer Research and the Reagan-Udall Foundation, I think, are exemplary of that.
Maybe we'll even see some of those lines blur a little bit between some of these types of more observational studies and the clinical studies, you know, along the lines of perhaps with improved data standards and consistency on the observational side. Maybe those will even begin to serve as potential for external controls or things like that that could accelerate the clinical development.
Totally agree.
Well, I want to thank the panel for a great discussion today. We certainly could go on for quite more time. I think there's a lot of great things that are happening, and congratulations to all of you for catalyzing them. It's been a pleasure to talk with you, and thanks to the team at Duke for having us. I will now turn things back over to Duke at the Duke team and Dr. McClellan for our next session.
Hey, Jeff. Jeff, thank you very much. Susan, all of our panelists for those really insightful remarks and a great discussion. Now for this last part of our meeting, I'm very pleased to introduce Principal Deputy Commissioner Amy Abernethy for our fireside chat about the future of real-world evidence. Amy, thanks for making time to join us today.
Hi, Mark, and thank you very much for having me. It's an honor.
Yeah, well, we have a lot to talk about here, I think. You've been right at the center. You know, the theme here is what's happened with real-world evidence in COVID and heading beyond that. You've been right at the center of the FDA's efforts around real-world evidence in COVID with the evidence accelerators we talked about earlier. So maybe you could just start off by talking a little bit about how you've seen the most important shifts in the use of real-world data and real-world evidence in conjunction with the pandemic. And then we'll talk about where things are going from here.
Yeah, we've heard a lot today about shifts in thinking and shifts in understanding around capabilities. But I want to highlight another important outcome as it relates to what's been going on with real-world data in the context of COVID-19. And that's what I largely call familiarity. A third part of FDA's 2018 framework on real-world evidence was really focusing on understanding the use cases to which we could put real-world data in service of those tasks. And, understanding those use cases not only means just describing the use case at a top line, such as post-marketing commitments and requirements, but actually really understanding how is it going to work? Where are the opportunities and where are the pitfalls? And so one of the huge things that's happened in the context of real-world data for COVID-19 is we're rapidly building a muscle around understanding the possible. And so that's the first thing I would say that's shifted pretty dramatically. The second thing that I would say that's shifted dramatically is that, and we've heard a little bit of this on the last panel, before COVID-19, there were a number of initiatives that were happening in the real-world data space that now we're starting to coalesce. But oftentimes we would talk about real-world data and real-world evidence as if this was a science, observational research, that had largely already been completely figured out and that we already knew what good looked like within the context of this space. But in fact, really, as we think about it, the data sets are evolving and the data set capabilities are evolving. The analytic capabilities are evolving. And we're actually really starting to evolve in our knowledge of what we can do with these data sets and their analyses. And so really, I think that this has highlighted the fact that there's an evolving science here that we've got to figure out and get right. And, some of those are really tactical in the context of COVID-19 and, it's coming up in different ways. But, one example is case definition. Another example that's going on in the Evidence Accelerator lab meeting right now is trying to decide what's time zero in a study. But really, there's a lot of detailed, difficult methodology work that needs to be done. And that work needs to be done in new ways, especially because our data sets are very different than traditional observational data sets in the future. The third thing that I would say here is that not only is it about building familiarity and being honest and humble about the fact that we need to build the science, we actually need to really build a really quick way of assessing what good looks like. And if I think back to the landscape of randomized controlled trials, we have been able to be very clear about key attributes that quickly help us understand, yes, this is a trial that I can trust. So whether or not it was adequately powered, whether or not it was randomized, language around masking or blinding. I mean, we've got these different features. And as we move into more real world data science, whether that is retrospective or prospective, being able to have a similar lexicon. And I think we're quickly figuring out many of those elements, which have been around for a long time in observational research, but now being able to more quickly codify and have a very efficient language here.
Yeah.
And the last thing I would say here, Mark, is that we are really seeing a new list of the kind of tasks that we can put real world data and real world evidence into place for. So, I think that with 21st century cures and with the sort of use cases that have been described to date, have been predominantly around tasks that I call replacement products for clinical trials, where, of course we would want to do the clinical trial if we could, but we're often asking, is there a way, if we can't do the clinical trial, can real world data help us with the totality of understanding? But now we're in a place where we're asking, can real world data help us with lots of different things? Patterns of care, understanding how to prioritize which clinical trials to do, better study design, helps us understand things like continuous evaluation of performance of diagnostics. And so this long list of new ways that we can use real world data that I think is going to persist to the future.
Yeah, so a lot to pick up there about where things may be headed in the future. One is on this point about what looks good. I think people have gotten a greater appreciation for just the complexity of data. It used to be about maybe more attention, at least my perception, around, well, these are observational studies, they're not randomized. So as you said, let's try to find a method that accounts for that. But it turns out that the data issues are pretty complex. I mean, this is healthcare data and less of an issue in the clinical trial context, because there you can kind of assume it all away. Just identify some very specific patients under some very specific conditions and collect data for that very specific trial purpose, but not very good for generalizing necessarily, and certainly not good for making it easy to integrate into routine practice. Are we further along now on dealing with those data complexity issues?
I certainly think that we are more aware of the fact that they exist and that we need to, again, advance the science to deal with them. I think we've got a long way to go in getting this right, and it falls into a number of categories. So first is getting better and better at generating high quality data sets, linking data sets, using different data sources to fill in data gaps and improve essentially the quality and completeness of the underlying data set. So that's one area. Another thing that we need to do is figure out what new analytic solutions can we use to solve for data set challenges that come up along the way. And that's a sort of another important area. And a third is that, as we move into this space of wanting to use more and more data, what are other innovations in data that will help us move this space forward? And, an example there might be synthetic data or tokenization. So examples that are technical innovations that can help us improve on the data space. What's interesting here to me is that, again, COVID-19 has given us the opportunity to surface these important issues and challenges and ask critical questions about how are we going to deal with them. And one of the key features of the collaboration that you've been hearing a lot about and the different models, such as what we're doing in the Evidence Accelerator, is to have people showcase their work, the nitty-gritty details, because it's actually that detailed activity that really is going to help us figure out how do we solve for these data-related issues and therefore reliability and validity-related issues. And what's interesting to me here is that the other part of this is likely going to be making sure we have new collaborators at the table that we don't necessarily always imagine have to be on the study team. So of course we need biostatisticians and we need to think about epidemiologists at the table. But we also need to make sure that we have the clinicians at the table who understand the idiosyncrasies of healthcare data and how information comes in. We have to have the software developers and the technologists who can think about not only the features of the underlying systems, but also how to make this better and automate things in the future. And so really have kind of a new cast of characters that are learning a lingua franca about how to do this together. And that's one of the things that's been really important in COVID-19 is to say we have to figure this out and we need to figure out with urgency. It means we have to learn how to listen to each other. One last thought, and is that, as we've been talking today about pragmatic trials and, essentially filling in the clinical trial data set with data from all of these different real world sources, those data challenges don't go away. So all the lessons learned are applicable across all these different spaces. And it's really important that we are humble about that important work that needs to be done there too.
Yeah, so more work ahead, and maybe this is a related question. One of the things that I heard in the previous session was that technology should be enabling us to do this a lot better, to put together the data, to understand what's there. But I don't know, Amy, I heard some concerns about the quality of the technologies that we're using to support these efforts to get to more meaningful ability to develop evidence that's like really relevant to patients. It's really patient-centered. Any thoughts about that? You've been in this field for a while, and it does seem like there's still some dissatisfaction.
There's a lot of dissatisfaction, just to make sure that I help with what my lens is. You probably know this. I ran the Center for Learning Healthcare at Duke, so we sort of tried to figure it out from that perspective, and then I was at a health tech company building real world data sets. But I also have a lot of experience in the EHR space, and so having been in those different spaces, and now also being on the regulatory side. One of the things that I'm struck by is what I call vendor think, right? We're going to specify what vendors need to build. And, then basically we say to a tech company, build against this list. And therefore we get essentially what we've asked for. And then we, meanwhile, start imagining new ways to use solutions. And so as a result, we end up with a mismatch between what those solutions can do and what we start imagining them to be used for. And meanwhile, the tech industry is building in a completely different parallel, oftentimes not well connected to what we're talking about. So I think one of the things that COVID-19 has exposed, and certainly something that I've been very aware of for a while, is that if we don't have all of the parties at the table, again, as co-collaborators, as people who are creating together, you end up with that mismatch. And so really what we need, if we're going to continue to do this going forward, is more of the technology builders, including on the data and software side at the table. In fact, in our Technology Modernization Action Plan for FDA, which we announced last September, the third pillar of that plan was to open up communication channels with the software and data industries. I call this the FDA adjacent space. These are all the people who are building things that ultimately touch FDA in some way, shape, or form. And the reason for it was exactly this, that there's often a mismatch between what's possible from a software and a data side to what it is that we really want to see happen, or what's the world that we want to imagine for the future.
Yeah, and that bringing the parties together and shared action is something that definitely seems to have made some progress in COVID, as people have a real public good commitment to figure out this pandemic better. You think that's going to continue, or are there any ways to build on some of these shared approaches like FDA has undertaken with the Evidence Accelerator and related work?
So, I'm an optimist at heart, so I'm going to say yes. I actually don't think we can go back, because we now know how much more progress we can make when we really dig in and figure this out together. Yeah, there will be some stepping back as people go back to their sort of normal interfaces from a business and society perspective. But what are some of the lessons that we've learned? We've learned that safe spaces to learn from each other and transparency actually leads to more innovation. We've learned that, by the way, there's oftentimes a lot of innovation happening that we haven't had a chance to even imagine. And when we see that, it allows us to imagine what we could even do further. And one of the things that we've been doing very explicitly in the Evidence Accelerator is there's usually 2 presentations in every one of our lab meetings that are what I call capabilities discussions. They're intended to be in very short presentations that just sort of showcase capabilities that are evolving so people can imagine where this story might go if they get leveraged. And that's about transparency. And then on the collaboration side, what is happening is essentially new bedfellows who ultimately now are learning how to work together and having new conversations. And so that's one of the other things. And it goes back to this point around familiarity. You really can't figure out how to work together unless you know how to look each other in the eye, or at least sort of via Zoom video, and figure out what's it going to take to trust each other. And I think that that's going to be something that will endure.
Yeah, well, so I'd like to think of myself as an optimist at heart too, but for better or worse, I'm an economist by training. So it's like, I like these ideas for getting people to work together. I also like to think about, well, how can we really make it in people's interest more? And I want to go back to your comment about the importance of familiarity, not just the concepts, not just the framework, but actually roll up your sleeves, do the real use cases. So we've seen some of that happen in COVID, as you've talked about. Looking beyond COVID, one of the ideas that we've been developing with collaborators is, could there be a kind of a partnership effort, maybe something that PDUFA could support, with some intentionality around finding some use cases where there are companies with a problem they'd like to have addressed, or that could be addressed through real world evidence, where FDA has some interest as well, and then put some extra efforts into it to get over that chicken and egg problem I mentioned at the beginning around FDA wanting to provide good guidance, but recognizing that you can't just, this is complex enough, you can't just say, check, do these 4 things and we're done. And on the other hand, industry wanting to participate, but not necessarily wanting to invest until they get even more certainty, which we don't have yet without all that familiarity. Is that something that could help with maybe addressing this use case approach? Because it does seem to me that if people were willing to get together on that, invest a bit more in return for maybe being a bit more transparent and public, not about necessarily proprietary data, but what happened, what was learned along the way, so that people can learn from that experience more. Maybe that could help accelerate. But that's one approach. Maybe there are other ideas for getting more of those real use cases executed and shared, and really getting much more familiar, building on the experience to date. So
I strongly believe in the use case approach. And importantly, I don't want to call it a pilot approach. One of the concerns that I worry about is where we pilot ourselves to death. But use cases actually have a very specific task, which is to be a living example and help us understand what core elements need to be built to allow this to ultimately scale and be done not 3 times, but 50 and 100 times in the future. And so as we have a use case approach, what we do is not only learn the possible, but we learn what's missing and then start to figure out what else do we need to bring to the table. I think the other advantage of use cases is that it helps us figure out the lingua franca, again, the way of sort of talking to each other. So I think that the use case approach is going to be a requirement in figuring out how to move this forward, but I would add it with a couple caveats. One, as you said, there needs to be resources behind it. And resources are important because it keeps people coming to the table. 2, though, is that importantly with use cases is the criticality of something called constraints, right? You need to build in a constraints model because ultimately that sort of forces you to figure out the trade-offs. You're an economist, so you can kind of like, that is really critical to use cases. And then the other thing is to think about what are we going to learn and how do we get that codified very quickly and be able to move that forward. And that goes back to that transparency piece to move this forward. But I do think that that's going to be the critical approach here. And I think the other piece is we have to have very intentional urgency. We need to do the right work, but we need to move it forward. One of the things that COVID-19 has taught us is we don't need 5-year cycles for things. Right? We need to figure out how we do things quickly and iterate and move.
Yeah, one related use case, and I know we've only got a couple minutes left, but I know something you've been thinking about is use cases that extend beyond FDA to issues that CMS or payers may care about too. And, sticking with our theme of the totality of evidence, people have always viewed devices as something that they get developed, they get on the market, you get more experience, they get better. Drugs were, I think, historically viewed as, well, you do the clinical trials and then that's the main evidence. But now we're seeing, for additional uses, label extensions, and then for many more complex biologic products, gene therapies and the like, those are going to hopefully keep getting better once they're available. And if you are moving towards more of this life cycle approach, seems like that's going to need real world evidence and maybe some shared interests among manufacturers, patients, clinicians, and also payers like CMS. Any thoughts or opportunities there?
Absolutely. So first of all, I think we'd all like to have really robust clinical trials answer every single question that we have in front of us. And the answer there is, of course. But there's going to be many questions where real world data and real world evidence is going to be required to help us fill in the rest of the story. And so that sort of totality of the evidence approach, I think, is very important. This is not about lowering the evidence standard. It's actually really about making sure that we have all the information we need to take care of patients and that we can do so in an inclusive way. And one of the other elements that I've been thinking a lot about is this issue of multi-purpose data, right? So data sets that can be now used to serve different tasks because we make sure that the right variables are included in the data sets. So CMS and FDA have slightly different outcome measures that are going to be needed within the context of those data sets, but the same data set built in the right way can actually now be used for these dual purposes. And thinking about then how can we accelerate our path to having more understanding around products like, and breakthrough device is a really great example, right? And that will help us then simultaneously get the information that we need for multiple tasks, understanding value, understanding performance across time, understanding performance in different populations. And that can be done if we really are thoughtful about making sure that the data sets that are getting generated have the right variables incorporated to be able to serve both tasks. And, we've been talking all day about the different technological capabilities that are now possible or we're going to be possible in the future. And I submit that that's going to be really a reality already now and in the near term.
Yeah, it really does need to be enabled by the infrastructure that you're developing. Amy, thanks for all your leadership on this effort. We're really lucky to have you at FDA. Not so lucky with the pandemic, but really lucky that you're there and thinking about not only how we can make the most of real world data and real world evidence right now in the pandemic, but looking forward to all of these in important further directions. Really appreciate your joining us this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, and we are, as you all have heard today, there are a lot of opportunities to leverage real world data, real world evidence for COVID and also moving beyond COVID. As you've heard, there are many existing efforts that we can build on. You heard about a lot of them today. I wish we'd had even more time to go deeper, but as you know, we'll be continuing to work on these issues at Duke Margolis in our Real World Evidence Collaborative and other venues, and also in collaboration with FDA and all of you in other venues. We think that this idea of taking on some collaborative use cases that can be built out is a very promising direction that's made a difference in COVID, can make a difference moving beyond, including in such areas as practical clinical trials that build off a real world infrastructure. And just as Amy emphasized in our last discussion, infrastructure support for all of this is something that we're all going to need to keep building together. So I'd like to thank everyone who made today's event possible. That starts with our moderators, Susan Denser and Jeff Allen, for facilitating such outstanding discussions. And also a special thanks to our esteemed speakers and panelists, a diverse set of perspectives on very important topics related to both approaching these real world evidence issues rigorously and also practically and informatively. And finally, all of you who joined the event today, we hope to continue to see you at Duke Margolis events and in collaboration on many of these real world data, real world evidence projects. And of course, special thanks to the team at Duke Margolis that put this all together. Narosha Mahendraratnam, letterer, Marta Rosinska, Morgan Romine, Adam Croach, Christina Silcox, Patty Green, Luke DeRoche, Kelly Wall, Sarah Sheehan, Joy Eckhart, Kara Merson, Valerie Parker, and Mira Gill. A great team, privileged to work with all of them and with all of you. Thank you very much for joining us today, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the afternoon.